Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where we take a quiet look at the parts of our world that seem familiar until someone asks a slightly inconvenient question about them. Tonight, that question begins beneath a canopy of old trees. It begins in places described as untouched, primeval, protected, and wild, where moss covers fallen trunks, roots cross the ground in thick ridges, and official signs politely remind visitors to stay on the path. These forests are often presented as survivors from an age before roads, cities, and organised agriculture. They are treated as examples of nature left to itself, places where human hands arrived late and did very little. But what if that description is incomplete? What if some of the oldest forests on Earth are not simply remnants of wilderness? What if they are remnants of cultivation so old, so large, and so well integrated into the landscape that modern observers no longer recognise it as cultivation at all? The idea sounds unusual because most of us have been taught to recognise agriculture by its neatness. We expect straight rows, open fields, fences, irrigation pipes, and machines making determined noises before breakfast. A farm is a place where the original vegetation has been removed and replaced by a small number of useful plants. A forest, by contrast, is supposed to be the place where planting stops. Trees grow where seeds happen to fall, animals eat what they can find, and no one is responsible for keeping the whole arrangement productive. That division is convenient, but it is not always accurate. Human beings have managed forests for thousands of years without turning them into fields. They have selected useful trees, moved seeds, opened clearings, controlled fire, shaped water flow, protected certain species, removed others, and created landscapes that could produce food, medicine, fibre, timber, and animal feed over very long periods. Much of this work leaves no stone walls, no metal machinery, and no written operating manual tucked beneath a convenient rock. A mature food forest can appear untidy, while being highly organised. It may include tall nut trees forming the upper canopy, smaller fruit trees beneath them, berry-producing shrubs along the edges, edible roots below ground, climbing vines using trunks for support, and fungi connected to the roots of several species at once. One plant may provide shade for another. A deep-rooted tree may bring minerals closer to the surface. Fallen leaves may feed the soil. Birds and mammals may spread seeds through the system, while doing what birds and mammals generally do, which is work without filling in any paperwork. When such a landscape is actively managed, people make small adjustments rather than rebuilding it every year. They prune, harvest, transplant, burn selected patches, protect young growth, and guide succession. If the managers disappear, the system does not immediately stop. It continues growing. Paths close, boundaries soften, and the original design becomes harder to see, but many of the productive relationships remain. That possibility changes the way we might look at ancient woodland. Consider Białowieża forest on the border of Poland and Belarus, known for its old trees, European bison, rich soils, and long history of royal and state protection. It is often described as a surviving fragment of the primeval lowland forest that once covered much of Europe. That description is broadly useful, but it can hide a complicated history. People hunted there, gathered plants, managed animals, cut timber in selected areas, made honey, travelled along routes through the forest, and lived in communities around its edges. Protection did not always mean the absence of people. At different times, it meant that certain people controlled who could enter, what could be taken, and which uses were considered legitimate. A forest reserved for rulers can later be remembered as a forest untouched by anyone, especially when the people doing the gathering, burning, herding, and seasonal work left few written records of their own. Far to the east, Yakushima presents a different kind of ancient landscape. The island is famous for its cedar trees, some of which are believed to be extremely old, and for a climate so wet that almost every surface appears to have entered into a permanent agreement with moss. The forests have been logged, protected, mapped, studied, and turned into symbols of natural endurance. Yet even there, the boundary between untouched nature and long-term human influence is not simple. Cedar was valuable. Mountain roots mattered. Local people gathered resources. Religious ideas shaped how particular trees and places were treated. Some areas were cut heavily, while others remained difficult to reach or were protected for cultural reasons. When modern visitors see enormous trunks surrounded by dense vegetation, it is tempting to imagine that the whole landscape has existed beyond human use. The real story is more layered, with periods of intervention, abandonment, protection, and regrowth. Aokigahara, growing across lava near Mount Fuji, attracts even more speculation, because its geology affects compasses, roots spread across shallow soils, and the dense vegetation makes orientation difficult. Its reputation has often overshadowed the ordinary ecological processes taking place there. Trees adapt to the lava field, roots follow cracks, moss covers exposed rock, and the irregular ground creates a forest that feels older and stranger than some parts of it really are. Claims about electromagnetic anomalies are frequently exaggerated, although local mineral conditions can affect certain instruments. That distinction is important. A compass behaving oddly in one place does not automatically indicate hidden machinery beneath the roots. It may indicate iron-rich rock, a damaged compass, or someone standing beside a large metal object, while becoming increasingly excited about the mystery. Even so, landscapes with unusual geology can support unusual biological arrangements, and those arrangements deserve careful study without assuming either that everything is ordinary or that every irregular reading points to a forgotten technology. The larger theory links these forests and others like them through several claimed patterns. Supporters point to groups of edible and medicinal species growing together in combinations that seem unusually useful. They describe fruiting cycles that appear coordinated across wide areas, with nuts, berries, and tree fruits becoming available in sequences that could feed people and animals through much of the year. They note tree age distributions that seem to radiate from older central zones, as if planting expanded outward over generations. Beneath the soil, they look to interconnected roots and fungal networks as evidence of a system that moves water and nutrients efficiently. They also collect old descriptions of forests that produced food in abundance without visible ploughing or sowing. Taken separately, each observation may have a straightforward explanation. Taken together, they create a question that is difficult to dismiss without investigation. Where are you listening from tonight, and what sort of forest grows nearest to you? Perhaps you live beside woodland that has always been called natural, even though an old wall runs through it for no obvious reason. Perhaps there is a row of mature fruit trees standing far from the nearest house. Maybe you know a place where hazel, plum, apple, chestnut, or walnut seem to gather in one part of the landscape. It could be an abandoned farm. It could mark an old road, a monastery garden, a village lost to disease or war, or simply the habits of birds with very specific dining preferences. Local landscapes carry many histories at once, and a single grove can pass through several identities. It may begin as a garden, become common land, turn into a hunting reserve, grow into woodland, and eventually receive a sign explaining that it is ancient wilderness. The sign is not necessarily lying. It is simply starting the story later than the trees do. If you find these slow investigations calming, interesting, or useful company, while your own surroundings become quieter, you can give the video a like and subscribe to Just About Earth. It helps this small corner of the internet reach other listeners who enjoy looking at familiar places from an unfamiliar angle. You might also leave a comment about the oldest forest, orchard, or overgrown landscape you have visited. The details people remember are often surprisingly specific. Someone recalls that a certain spring never dried. Someone else remembers gathering nuts where no nut trees appear on modern maps. A grandparent mentions a path that officials later closed. These memories do not prove a theory, but they can point toward records, maps, pollen studies, or archaeological sites that formal surveys have overlooked. The theory becomes more controversial when it claims that access to certain landscapes was restricted not only for conservation, hunting, timber, or national security, but also to hide what those landscapes reveal. Between roughly 1850 and 1900, many governments did increase their control over forests and rural land. This happened across Europe, Japan, North America, and other regions, although the reasons differed from place to place. States improved surveying, formalized property boundaries, expanded scientific forestry, created hunting reserves, established national parks, and limited traditional practices such as grazing, wood gathering, burning, and seasonal harvesting. Local communities were sometimes removed or prevented from using land they had relied on for generations. Officials often describe these restrictions as modernization, conservation, efficient management, or protection from destructive use. There is no solid evidence that all of these changes were coordinated by a single authority attempting to conceal ancient food forests. The timing can be explained by broader developments that affected many countries at once. Industrialization increased demand for timber. Expanding governments wanted clearer control over land and taxation. Railways made remote forests commercially valuable. New scientific institutions promoted standardized forestry. Elites wanted exclusive hunting areas. Conservation movements responded to rapid logging and wildlife decline. Colonial governments frequently treated local land practices as obstacles to administration. Similar policies appeared because many states faced similar pressures, not necessarily because they shared a secret plan. Yet the consequences of those policies are still relevant to the mystery. When residents were removed, their knowledge went with them. When gathering became illegal, productive groves stopped being harvested. When controlled burns were banned, the balance of species changed. When official foresters replaced local managers, the purpose of older plant arrangements could be forgotten. After several generations, a landscape once shaped through regular human activity might appear unmanaged. The state did not need to erase an ancient civilization deliberately. Ordinary regulation, displacement, and administrative confidence could erase the meaning of a landscape without anyone fully understanding what had been lost. A government fence can protect a forest and hide its history at the same time. Restricted access may prevent logging, poaching, erosion, disease, and damage from large numbers of visitors. It can also make independent research difficult. Soil sampling, root excavation, tree coring, and genetic testing are often limited for good ecological reasons, but restrictions naturally attract suspicion when authorities provide little explanation. People hear that an area is protected, see armed guards or locked gates, and assume the most dramatic possibility. Occasionally, the dramatic possibility is worth checking. More often, the explanation involves rare species, dangerous terrain, border security, private ownership, military use, or a department that has not updated its visitor policy since someone typed it on a machine with no delete key. The useful approach is not to treat every restriction as proof of concealment. It is to ask what kind of evidence should exist if the food forest theory is correct. A deliberately engineered landscape would likely show patterns in genetics, age, distribution, and soil. Useful species might be more closely related to cultivated varieties than to nearby wild populations. Trees could cluster along former settlement routes, water systems, or terraces. Pollen records might show sudden increases in selected food plants. Charcoal layers could reveal repeated low-intensity burning. Ancient DNA might show that certain species were transported from distant regions. Isotopic analysis could indicate long-term changes in soil fertility. Archaeological remains might include storage pits, processing tools, paths, or low earthworks hidden beneath vegetation. Some of these signs have already been found in landscapes once considered purely natural, though not always in the forests named by the theory. Research in several parts of the world has shown that people shaped plant communities over long periods. The Amazon contains concentrations of useful tree species near archaeological sites. Indigenous burning influenced woodland and grassland mosaics in Australia and North America. European forests preserve the effects of coppicing, pannage, charcoal production, wood pasture, and nut harvesting. In Japan, Satoyama landscapes connected villages, fields, secondary forests, and water systems in carefully maintained cycles. None of this requires a vanished advanced civilization. It shows that sophisticated landscape management can be widespread, durable, and easy for outsiders to misunderstand. The phrase forgotten civilization can also distract us from people whose histories are not actually forgotten, only neglected. Communities may have left oral traditions rather than monumental architecture. Their work may have been dismissed because it did not resemble European farming or later industrial forestry. When colonists or central governments encountered productive landscapes, they sometimes assumed that abundance had arisen naturally. This made it easier to claim the land. If no one had created the forest, then no one needed to be credited for maintaining it. If no one was farming in a recognizable way, officials could describe the area as empty. The idea of untouched wilderness has sometimes protected ecosystems, but it has also been used to remove the people who helped create them. That history offers a grounded version of the theory. Ancient food forests may exist, but their creators need not have possessed lost machines, global coordination, or unknown scientific powers. They may have been ordinary human communities with extraordinary patience. A system developed over centuries can look impossibly advanced to a society accustomed to annual harvests and short investment cycles. Planting a tree whose greatest yields will arrive after the planter's death requires a different relationship with land. Maintaining a forest for descendants you will never meet requires social continuity. Modern institutions often struggle to plan beyond the next budget review, so a landscape designed over 15 generations can seem almost supernatural. Claims of synchronized fruiting deserve similar caution. Many tree species do produce large seed crops in the same year, a phenomenon often called masting. Weather, pollination, stored energy, and evolutionary pressure can cause trees across large areas to fruit together. This can overwhelm animals that eat the seeds, allowing some seeds to survive and grow. Such coordination does not require human design. However, people could still have selected and encouraged species with complementary fruiting patterns. A natural process can become part of a managed system. The question is not whether people invented synchronized fruiting, but whether they understood it well enough to build food security around it. Root networks and fungal connections are also real, though popular accounts sometimes give them more intention than the evidence supports. Trees exchange nutrients and chemical signals through roots and mycorrhizal fungi. Larger trees can influence the survival of seedlings. Fungal networks can connect several plants. Describing this as a forest internet is helpful, until we begin imagining the trees sending each other complaints about tourists. These relationships are biological, competitive, cooperative, and constantly changing. Ancient managers may have observed which species grew well together without knowing the chemistry involved. Practical knowledge does not require a laboratory explanation. A person can understand that one tree improves the growth of another long before anyone identifies nitrogen, hormones, or fungal transport pathways. The same applies to water. Mature forests slow rainfall, store moisture in soil, reduce erosion, and create local microclimates. Human managers can improve these effects through terraces, ponds, swales, fallen timber, stone lines, and careful planting along slopes. After centuries, these features may become difficult to distinguish from natural landforms. A shallow depression fills with leaves and becomes a wet patch. A terrace edge collapses and turns into a ridge. A channel becomes a stream. Roots strengthen the shape while also hiding it. Archaeologists trained to look for buildings may walk over the remains of water infrastructure without recognizing it, especially when the infrastructure was designed to work with erosion rather than resist it completely. This is why the forest that was never wild is not necessarily a forest hiding something beneath it. The forest itself may be the thing we fail to identify. Its canopy could be the roof of an agricultural system. Its root zone could be the water network. Its animals could be harvesters, seed carriers, and pest control. Its clearings could be production zones. Its paths could connect seasonal resources. Its apparent disorder could be the result of a design based on relationships rather than straight lines. The strongest version of the theory claims that authorities recognized this and deliberately sealed the forest to prevent the public from discovering a form of abundance that would challenge modern systems of land ownership and food production. That claim requires evidence that has not been established. It assumes motives that are difficult to prove and coordination that would have been difficult to maintain. Governments rarely manage to keep ordinary paperwork consistent across departments, which makes a century-long international forest conspiracy an ambitious administrative achievement. A more plausible possibility is that several interests overlapped. States wanted control, scientists wanted protected study areas, landowners wanted exclusive rights, conservationists wanted to prevent destruction. Local knowledge was undervalued. Industrial agriculture favoured open, measurable production. Forest-based systems were difficult to tax, standardise and own in simple parcels. Over time, the official story became cleaner than the real one. The land was labelled natural, the former users were described as intruders, and the old methods faded from memory. That does not make the result harmless. Losing knowledge of perennial food systems may have narrowed the choices available to later societies. Modern agriculture produces enormous quantities of food, but it often depends on disturbed soil, fossil fuels, fertilizers, pesticides, irrigation, and simplified ecosystems. Ancient forest management may not offer a complete replacement, especially for dense urban populations, but it could provide lessons in resilience, diversity, and long-term productivity. A mature chestnut grove, for example, can produce a starchy food from trees while protecting soil and supporting many other species. Fruit and nut systems can continue through weather conditions that destroy annual crops. Forest gardens can produce food at several heights and across different seasons. Perhaps the most important question is not whether a forgotten civilization created every ancient grove. It is whether we have become so accustomed to one form of agriculture that we no longer recognize others. We may be looking for plough marks in a system that used shade. We may be searching for granaries where food was stored on living branches. We may expect irrigation canals while water was held in soil, roots, ponds, and decaying wood. We may assume that a lack of ruins means a lack of organisation. As the night settles around you, picture an old forest without adding anything supernatural to it. There are tall trees producing nuts, smaller trees carrying fruit, berry shrubs near the edges, edible leaves and roots, mushrooms appearing after rain, animals moving seeds, and people who know exactly when and where each resource becomes available. They do not need to clear the whole landscape. They need to remember it. Their map is seasonal, their work is distributed, their harvest does not arrive on one afternoon with a machine. It arrives in stages, moving from canopy to clearing, from wet ground to dry ridge, from spring shoots to autumn nuts. Then imagine those people gone and the knowledge interrupted. The productive species remain, the paths fade, the names change, officials arrive, draw boundaries and classify the place according to a new system. A managed landscape becomes a reserve, a food source becomes scenery, a living design becomes wilderness. To understand whether that transformation really happened, we first need to understand how such a forest would feed people in practice, what kinds of species would be combined, how harvests could be spread through the year, and how a system could continue producing long after its original managers had disappeared from view. To understand how an ancient food forest might survive long after its creators were gone, it helps to forget the modern image of a farm for a moment. Picture a place where the soil is almost never turned, where no single crop covers the horizon, and where the harvest does not arrive all at once. Food appears in stages. Tender shoots and leaves emerge early in the year. Flowers attract insects. Berries ripen along sunny edges. Fruits develop under the middle canopy. Nuts fall from the tallest trees. Roots and tubers remain underground until needed. Mushrooms appear after rain, usually when no one has brought an appropriate basket. Animals move through the system, eating some of the harvest, spreading seeds, clearing vegetation, and returning nutrients to the soil in the least elegant way available. Such a landscape can look as though it feeds itself because much of the work happens without visible human effort. Sunlight powers the leaves. Rain enters the soil instead of running quickly across bare ground. Fungi and microorganisms break down dead material. Deep roots reach minerals that shallow-rooted plants cannot access. Fallen leaves form a protective layer that holds moisture, limits weeds, and slowly becomes new soil. Birds carry seeds between clearings. Pollinating insects move from flower to flower. Larger animals open pathways, disperse patches of earth, and occasionally prune branches with all the precision of a hungry animal, pulling at whatever it can reach. The people managing this kind of system do not need to perform every task themselves. Their role is to guide the relationships already taking place. They decide which plants deserve more space, which trees should be cut, which seedlings should be protected, and which animals should be encouraged or controlled. They may move useful plants from one valley to another, burn small areas to reduce competition, or create openings where light-loving species can grow. They may harvest heavily in one place and leave another untouched. The work is real, but much of it is intermittent. A field requires repeated preparation. A mature grove may need only occasional attention, provided that generations of earlier work have already established the right structure. This is why ancient groves are easy to underestimate. A visitor arriving during a quiet season may see no food at all. The berries have finished, the nuts have not fallen, the edible leaves are too old, the roots are hidden, and the mushrooms have decided to remain underground until the visitor goes home. A local person familiar with the landscape would see the same place differently. They would know which slope warms first in spring, which trees fruit after a cold winter, where water remains during dry months, and which patch should be left alone because it will be productive later. The value of the forest is not obvious from a single visit. It becomes clear through a calendar of observation. Many traditional systems worked in this way. In parts of Europe, communities depended heavily on chestnut groves. Chestnuts could be eaten fresh, dried, stored, or ground into flour. A mature tree produced food year after year while also stabilizing slopes and providing wood, leaves, and shade. In some mountain regions, chestnut was so important that it functioned less like an occasional snack and more like a staple crop. The landscape could support villages without resembling a wheat field. A person unfamiliar with the system might see woodland. The people living there saw bread growing on trees. Oak landscapes provided another form of long-term abundance. Acorns fed pigs, deer, and people, although human use required knowledge of which species were suitable and how to remove bitter compounds. In wood pasture systems, widely spaced oaks allowed grass and herbs to grow beneath them. Livestock grazed below while the canopy produced mast, shade, timber, and habitat. The result was neither dense forest nor open farmland, but a managed middle ground. Similar systems survived in the Iberian Dehesa and Montado landscapes, where cork oak, holm oak, pasture, livestock, and seasonal crops were combined. These places demonstrate that a useful landscape does not need to choose between trees and food production. It can do both, although it generally requires people who understand when to graze, when to cut, and when to leave the trees in peace. Hazel offered nuts, flexible poles, fuel, fencing material, and handles for tools. Coppicing allowed stems to be cut near the ground and regrow repeatedly from the same root system. A hazel stool could remain productive for a very long time if managed in cycles. Willow, ash, lime and other trees were treated in similar ways for different purposes. Pollarding kept new growth above the reach of grazing animals. Coppicing produced straight stems at ground level. These techniques created woodland structures that looked natural to later observers, but were actually shaped by repeated cutting over centuries. A tree's form can preserve evidence of such work. Multiple trunks growing from a single base may indicate old coppicing. Thick, shortened trunks with new branches emerging high above the ground may indicate pollarding. Clusters of trees of similar age can reveal a pass-cutting cycle. Yet these signs become harder to read when management stops. New growth becomes tangled, old trunks collapse, and younger trees fill the openings. Several generations later, the original system may appear irregular enough to be called wild. The word self-sustaining can also be misleading. No productive landscape is completely independent. Nutrients move, species compete, storms cause damage, diseases spread, climate changes. A grove that survives for centuries may do so because people continue making small corrections. The work is less obvious than annual ploughing, but it is still important. A fruit tree left entirely alone may continue producing, though perhaps less reliably. A nut grove may become crowded with shade-tolerant species. A clearing may close. A water channel may fill with debris. The system can persist, but its balance slowly shifts. What makes these systems remarkable is not that they require no labour. It is that they store labour in living form. Someone plants a tree, someone else protects it from animals, a later generation prunes it. Another gathers seed from its best offspring and plants those nearby. Over time, the landscape becomes more useful because earlier decisions continue to shape later harvests. The people maintaining it are working with accumulated biological capital, although they probably did not describe it that way because no one enjoys being asked to calculate the depreciation schedule of a walnut tree. This stored effort can continue after the original society changes or disappears. An abandoned orchard may produce fruit for decades. A chestnut grove may survive for centuries. Berry shrubs can spread along old boundaries. Nut trees can reproduce around former settlements. Vines continue climbing whatever remains available. Animals distribute seeds beyond the original planting area. As the system expands, it becomes difficult to decide where deliberate design ends and natural succession begins. That uncertainty lies at the centre of the food forest theory. If a society planted a useful species and birds later spread it across several valleys, are the distant trees part of the original design? If people created clearings that remained open because animals grazed them, is the resulting habitat natural or managed? If a forest contains descendants of trees selected for larger fruit thousands of years ago, does it still count as agriculture? Our categories work well on maps but become less reliable on the ground. Plants do not respect the boundaries between culture and nature. A seed does not care whether it was carried by a person, a bird, or a river. Once it grows, its descendants can move again. Human selection may continue through simple habits. People eat the sweetest fruit and throw the seeds near their homes. They gather nuts from the most productive trees and carry some along a route. They protect seedlings that appear in useful places. No central plan is required. Over centuries, repeated preference can change the genetics and distribution of plants across a wide region. This process has been documented in many cultivated species. Wild plants become different when people repeatedly select useful traits. Fruits grow larger, shells become thinner, ripening times change, bitterness decreases, seeds lose the ability to disperse without help. Yet domestication does not always produce a plant that must grow in a field. Some trees remain capable of surviving within a forest, while still carrying signs of human selection. Their descendants may look wild to anyone who does not examine their genetics or compare them with distant populations. The Amazon provides one of the clearest examples of why dense forests should not automatically be treated as untouched. Archaeological research has revealed earthworks, settlement remains, managed soils, and concentrations of useful plant species across areas once described as pristine wilderness. Amazonian dark earth, often called terra preta, contains unusually fertile soil created through long-term human activity, involving charcoal, organic waste, food remains, and other materials. These soils can remain productive for centuries. Useful trees are often more common near ancient settlement sites, suggesting that past communities altered the composition of the forest in ways that survived long after the settlements themselves were abandoned. This does not mean the entire Amazon was one enormous orchard. It means that large areas contained a history of human management far more extensive than earlier outsiders assumed. People cultivated some places intensively, influenced others more lightly, and left patterns that became difficult to distinguish from natural forest. The lesson applies beyond the Amazon. When archaeologists change the methods they use, they often discover evidence that the landscape was never as empty as official description suggested. In North America, indigenous communities managed oak groves, berry grounds, meadows, and woodland edges through controlled burning, pruning, transplanting, selective harvesting, and the movement of useful species. Regular low-intensity fire could prevent dense undergrowth, promote certain food plants, improve habitat for game, and reduce the risk of larger fires. When colonial authorities suppressed these practices and removed communities from the land, the ecology changed. Forests became denser in some regions, grasslands shrank, and species associated with open habitats declined. Later observers sometimes treated the altered, denser forest as the original natural condition, even though it had emerged after traditional management was interrupted. The same reversal can occur almost anywhere. A landscape shaped by people is abandoned. Vegetation changes. Later researchers record the new condition and use it as a baseline. Anything more open or productive is then described as disturbance. The process is understandable, because scientists must begin with the evidence available to them. The problem arises when the chosen starting point is mistaken for the beginning of history. Japanese Satayama landscapes offer another useful comparison. These were areas where villages, rice fields, ponds, grasslands, and secondary forests were linked through regular use. People gathered firewood, leaf litter, mushrooms, plants, and animal fodder. Material moved between forest and field. Leaves became fertilizer. Wood provided energy. Ponds supported irrigation. The landscape remained biologically diverse, partly because people created a mixture of habitats through repeated work. When rural use declined, some of these areas changed rapidly. Forests grew denser, open habitats disappeared, and species adapted to the older management pattern lost ground. Satayama does not prove that Yakushima or Aokigahara were designed as continent-scale food systems. It demonstrates that Japanese communities possessed detailed methods for managing wooded landscapes without making them resemble modern farms. It also shows how quickly those methods can be forgotten when economic and social conditions change. A practice that once seemed ordinary can become a specialist subject within a few generations. Old records describing forests that produced food without visible cultivation may reflect this difference in perception. A traveller accustomed to ploughed fields could arrive in a managed woodland and conclude that food grew there naturally. They might see people gathering rather than planting and assume there was no agriculture. They might not recognise pruning, burning, or selective protection as cultivation. The local community may have spent centuries arranging the conditions that made gathering possible, but the visitor sees only the final harvest. This misunderstanding appears in descriptions of many colonised landscapes. Outsiders often judged land use by whether it resembled their own. Mobile cultivation, seasonal movement, woodland management, and collective ownership were treated as absence rather than alternative systems. Productive land could then be called unused. Once it was called unused, taking control of it became easier to justify. The theory of ancient self-feeding groves becomes most persuasive when it stays close to this documented history. People have created long-lived tree-based food systems. Those systems can survive abandonment. Their remains can be mistaken for natural abundance. Governments and landowners have removed communities from managed landscapes. Official histories have sometimes ignored the earlier use of those places. None of these points requires hidden technology or a civilization erased from every archive. The more dramatic version proposes that some forests were designed on a scale and with a precision beyond anything credited to known societies. Supporters look at the number of useful species, the timing of harvests, and the apparent resilience of certain ecosystems. They argue that the system resembles infrastructure rather than ordinary woodland management. In this view, ancient builders did not merely encourage a few nut trees near settlements. They organised entire regions to produce food continuously, using layered planting, controlled water, animal movement, root relationships, and seasonal cycles. Such a system is possible in principle. Modern forest gardens use similar ideas on a smaller scale. Agroforestry combines trees with crops and livestock. Permaculture designers arrange plants according to height, root depth, sunlight, water needs, and mutual benefit. Farmers use nitrogen-fixing species, windbreaks, living fences, ground covers, and tree crops. None of these methods depends on unknown science. They depend on observation, patience, and the willingness to accept that a productive landscape may not look tidy. Scaling the system across hundreds or thousands of square kilometres would be far more difficult. Different soils, elevations, climates, and local species would require different designs. Harvesting would require paths, storage, processing, and social organisation. Large populations would need reliable staple foods, not only seasonal fruit. Animals would compete for much of the production. Crop failure could still occur. A forest may be resilient, but it is not an unlimited pantry, with polite squirrels waiting their turn. The phrase unlimited food forest should therefore be understood as a claim about renewal, not literally infinite supply. Trees can produce year after year, but each landscape has limits. Harvest too much, damage the soil, remove key animals, or change the water system, and productivity declines. A well-managed forest can sustain people for a very long time. It cannot feed an unlimited number of people without consequences. Even the most generous chestnut tree eventually notices when several thousand new neighbours arrive with baskets. Ancient communities would have understood these limits through experience. Harvest rules, taboos, seasonal restrictions, and sacred areas may have functioned as a resource management. A grove protected for religious reasons could also preserve seed trees. A ban on harvesting during a certain period could allow animals to feed or plants to reproduce. Restrictions that sound symbolic may have had practical ecological effects. Modern observers often separate spiritual practice from land management, but older societies may not have done so. This raises an interesting possibility concerning protected forests. Some modern restrictions may be recent versions of much older boundaries. A royal hunting reserve may have replaced a communal forest. A state conservation area may have replaced the royal reserve. Beneath those layers there may have been sacred groves, seasonal harvest zones, or village-managed woodland. The same place remains restricted, but the reason changes. Each new authority inherits the boundary and writes a new explanation for it. When local populations are removed, the forest may initially appear to thrive. Trees grow without cutting. Animals return. Dead wood accumulates. Conservationists may view this as recovery. In some cases, it is. In others, species that depended on traditional disturbance begin to decline. Open glades disappear. Fruit production changes as canopies close. Old trees become crowded. Fire risk rises because fuel is no longer removed. The absence of people is not automatically the same as ecological health. This makes the central question harder than it first appears. Are protected ancient forests surviving because human activity stopped, or are they slowly changing because the human activity that maintained them stopped? Different parts of the same forest may give different answers. One area may need strict protection from disturbance. Another may contain species that benefited from cutting or burning. A single policy applied across the whole landscape can preserve some relationships while erasing others. Evidence of old food production may survive in unexpected places. Pollen trapped in lake sediments can show when certain trees became more common. Charcoal can reveal repeated burning. Ancient paths may appear in elevation data even when invisible beneath vegetation. Soil phosphorus can indicate long-term occupation. Stone piles may mark cleared ground. Genetic studies can reveal whether trees came from local wild populations or were carried from elsewhere. Animal bones can show which species were hunted or managed. Residues on pottery and tools can identify foods that left no large structures behind. The most convincing case would combine several kinds of evidence. A cluster of fruit trees alone might mark an abandoned orchard. A geometric soil pattern alone might result from geology. A local story alone may change over time, but if useful species, modified soils, old paths, storage remains, pollen shifts, and unusual genetics all occur in the same area, the argument for deliberate management becomes much stronger. The difficulty is that ancient forests are challenging places to investigate. Excavation damages roots. Thick vegetation hides surface features. Wet soils destroy some materials. Protected status limits sampling. National borders complicate access. Historical records may be written in several languages or stored in local archives. Researchers trained in botany may not be looking for archaeology, while archaeologists may not know which plant distributions are unusual. The evidence sits between disciplines, which is a reliable way for it to remain unnoticed while everyone attends separate conferences. There is also the problem of expectation. A researcher looking for a settlement may focus on foundations, pottery and metal objects. A researcher studying forest ecology may treat old plant patterns as natural, unless there is clear evidence otherwise. A historian may find records of nut collection, but regard them as minor details. The food forest theory asks all three to examine the same landscape together. It treats trees, soil, stories, and regulations as parts of one historical system. That approach does not guarantee a dramatic discovery. It may reveal ordinary but extensive management by known communities. It may show that some supposed patterns disappear under careful measurement. It may also uncover landscapes that were far more productive and deliberately organised than current histories acknowledge. Either result would be useful because the real subject is not merely a forgotten civilization. It is the ease with which living infrastructure can vanish from human memory while remaining present on the ground. A stone building announces that someone built it. A grove does not. It grows, reproduces, and absorbs the evidence of its own construction. The better it functions as an ecosystem, the less artificial it appears. That is the unusual advantage of biological infrastructure and the reason it can remain hidden without anyone actively concealing it. By the time a mature food forest reaches a stable form, its designers may already be gone. Their descendants inherit a system they did not create, and perhaps they no longer remember every reason behind its arrangement. They continue harvesting because the trees produce. They repeat certain practices because those practices work. Later generations preserve only fragments of the knowledge. Then a war, law, disease, relocation, or economic change interrupts the tradition completely. The grove continues. Some trees fruit heavily one year and lightly the next. Animals respond to the changing supply. Seedlings appear in gaps. Fungi connect new roots to old networks. Water follows channels whose builders have no names. The system becomes less orderly in some places and more complex in others. To a future visitor, it looks self-created. That appearance may be one of the most successful outcomes its designers could have achieved. A field announces its dependence on people. A food forest hides it. A field stops quickly when abandoned. A grove can continue for centuries, quietly converting sunlight, water, soil, and accumulated knowledge into food. The next clue lies in the timing of that food, because forests do not produce at a steady rate. They pulse. Some years are generous, others disappointing, and across large distances, trees of the same species can release enormous crops almost together. Ecologists describe natural reasons for this behaviour, while supporters of the ancient infrastructure theory see something more deliberate in the sequence. To judge between those possibilities, we need to look closely at the claim that the trees are not merely fruiting, but fruiting together. The idea that trees across a large forest might fruit together can sound like evidence of planning, especially when the result appears useful to people. One year, the canopy produces an extraordinary number of nuts. The ground becomes covered with acorns, beech nuts, chestnuts, or seeds. Animals gather in larger numbers. People can collect more food than they could in an ordinary season. Then, for several years, the same trees produce far less. The pattern repeats, sometimes across many kilometres, with trees separated by valleys, rivers, and areas of younger growth responding as though they are following the same schedule. To someone walking beneath them, it can feel coordinated. The obvious question is whether the coordination comes from ecology, from ancient management, or from some combination of the two. Foresters and ecologists have studied this behaviour for a long time. It is commonly called masting, or mass seeding, and it occurs in many tree species. Oaks, beeches, chestnuts, pines, spruces, and several other plants can produce unusually large seed crops in the same year. These heavy fruiting periods are often followed by smaller harvests. The exact timing differs between species and locations, but the general behaviour is well established. Trees do not need a hidden signal generator beneath the soil to produce it. Weather, stored energy, pollination, predator pressure, and the shared response of genetically similar trees can create synchrony across wide areas. The first useful explanation is energy. Producing seeds is expensive for a tree. Leaves gather energy from sunlight, roots collect water and minerals, and the tree stores some of those resources in its tissues. A large seed crop uses a significant amount of that stored energy. After a heavy year, the tree may need time to rebuild its reserves before producing another one. If many trees in the same region experience similar weather and grow under similar conditions, they may accumulate and spend energy at roughly the same rate. The result looks organised because the trees are responding to the same environmental conditions. Weather can provide the cue that brings the process together. A warm spring, a dry summer, a mild winter, or a particular sequence of temperatures may affect flowering and seed development across an entire region. Trees separated by considerable distances can experience similar climate patterns. If the same species reacts to those conditions in the same way, synchrony emerges without direct communication. It is similar to hundreds of people opening umbrellas at once. They do not need to arrange it in advance. They are responding to the same rain, although one person will usually insist that it is only a light shower and continue without one. Pollination also benefits from coordination. Many forest trees rely on wind. If only a few individuals release pollen in a given year, much of it may miss a suitable flower. If large numbers flower together, the chance of successful pollination increases. A synchronized flowering event fills the air with pollen, allowing trees spread across the landscape to reproduce more effectively. For anyone with seasonal allergies, this is less a miracle of cooperation and more an annual administrative complaint from the respiratory system, but for the trees it can be highly efficient. Predator satiation is another important idea. Seeds are food for insects, birds, rodents, deer, wild pigs, and many other animals. If trees produced the same moderate number of seeds every year, animal populations could adjust to that reliable supply and consume a large proportion of it. A heavy mast year changes the calculation. The forest produces more seeds than the available animals can eat. Even after large numbers are consumed, enough remain to germinate. During the lean years that follow, seed-eating populations may decline because food is less abundant. When the next major crop appears, the trees again overwhelm them with quantity. This cycle can create a strong impression of deliberate abundance. A forest floor covered in nuts does not look like a random event. It looks like an enormous harvest that has arrived on schedule. If people lived near such a forest for generations, they would learn to predict the signs. They might watch flowering, rainfall, animal behaviour, and the previous year's crop. They could prepare storage, organise labour, move pigs into the woodland, or arrange seasonal gatherings around the expected mast. The synchrony would become part of human life, even if people did not create it. That distinction matters because using a natural cycle is not the same as engineering it, but the boundary can become blurred. A community may begin by observing which trees produce well. They protect those trees, remove competitors, spread their seeds, and favour offspring that fruit at useful times. Over many generations, the people are no longer merely responding to the forest, they are changing the composition of it. The original masting pattern remains natural, yet human selection may strengthen, widen, or redirect the harvest. Imagine a population that depends on several kinds of tree food. One species produces heavily in early autumn, another ripens later. A third can be dried and stored through winter. Berries fill the summer gap. Edible shoots and roots provide food in spring. The people do not need every species to fruit at the same moment. In fact, that would create a storage problem and a very tiring few weeks. A more useful design would spread the harvest through the year while allowing members of the same species to synchronize with one another. This may be what supporters of the ancient food forest theory mean when they describe coordinated fruiting cycles. The strongest version of the claim suggests that different species were deliberately selected to produce a sequence of harvests, almost like a biological calendar. The weaker and more plausible version is that people learned existing cycles and arranged their lives around them, gradually encouraging the species that filled seasonal gaps. The first claim requires evidence of large-scale planning. The second is consistent with well-documented forms of traditional ecological knowledge. The difference can be investigated. Researchers can compare the genetics of trees in an unusual grove with wild populations nearby. If the grove contains closely related individuals selected from a narrow group of ancestors, that may suggest planting or deliberate propagation. If trees carry traits associated with larger fruit, thinner shells, reduced bitterness, easier storage, or more predictable ripening, long-term human selection becomes more likely. Pollen records can show when a species suddenly became common. Charcoal and soil evidence can reveal whether people created the open conditions that certain fruiting trees prefer. Archaeological remains can identify storage, processing, and transport. Without that evidence, synchrony alone cannot prove design. Many natural systems produce patterns that look purposeful. Flocks turn together. Insects emerge in large numbers after years underground. Flowers open in response to day length. Fish migrate according to temperature and water flow. Human beings are very good at seeing intention in coordination, because coordinated human activity usually has an organizer. The forest operates differently. Similar organisms responding to shared conditions can generate order, without anyone issuing instructions. There is also growing research into the ways trees influence one another. Roots release chemicals into the soil. Fungal networks connect plants. Airborne compounds can signal damage or stress. Trees may alter flowering and growth in response to their neighbours. These processes are real, but they are often simplified in popular accounts. The phrase "trees communicate" is useful as long as we remember that communication in biology does not necessarily mean conscious conversation. An oak is not warning another oak that the squirrels have returned and should be watched carefully. Chemical signals, resource exchange, and shared fungal relationships can coordinate responses without anything resembling thought. Mycorrhizal fungi are particularly important. Their fine threads grow through soil and connect with plant roots. In exchange for sugars produced by photosynthesis, fungi help plants access water and nutrients. A single fungal network may interact with several plants, sometimes from different species. Carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and chemical signals can move through these relationships. Older trees may influence the survival of younger ones. Plants under stress may affect the network around them. The forest floor is therefore not a collection of isolated roots. It is a busy biological environment where competition and cooperation take place at the same time. Could ancient managers have understood these connections? They would not have needed microscopes or biochemical terminology. Observation would be enough to notice that certain mushrooms appear near certain trees, that seedlings grow better under some canopies than others, or that moving soil from an established grove helps young trees survive. Farmers and gardeners have long used practical knowledge before science explained the mechanism. People knew that compost improved soil before anyone measured microbial communities. They knew that some crops benefited from rotation before nitrogen cycles were described. A society working with forests over centuries could develop detailed rules about species combinations without knowing the word mycorrhiza. Supporters of the more dramatic theory go further and argue that fungal networks may have been intentionally used to synchronize fruiting across large landscapes. This is possible only in a limited sense based on current evidence. Fungi can influence nutrition, stress, and plant health, all of which affect reproduction. However, there is no established evidence that an ancient civilization built continent-scale fungal control systems or used root networks as precise biological wiring. The idea is interesting, but it should not be treated as a conclusion. A living network can support coordinated behavior without being engineered for that specific purpose. Tree age patterns add another layer to the claim. In some forests, researchers and amateur observers report groups of similarly aged trees arranged around older centres. If a mature grove produces large seed crops at intervals, new generations may establish after particular mast years. This can create visible age classes. A central group of old trees produces seeds. A storm, fire, grazing event, or human clearing opens nearby ground. Seedlings grow in the new light. Decades later, another disturbance creates another band of regeneration. The result can look like rings or waves moving outward. Human planting could produce a similar pattern. A settlement begins with a small grove. As the population expands, people add trees along paths, water sources, and new clearings. Different generations of planting radiate from the original centre. If the settlement disappears, the trees remain as an age pattern that records growth. To decide between these explanations, researchers need more than approximate visual estimates. Trees must be dated accurately, mapped, genetically compared, and studied alongside evidence of former occupation. Radiating patterns can also be misleading because landscapes are rarely flat or uniform. Soil depth, slope, water, sunlight, and exposure affect where seedlings survive. A ring may follow a contour line. A band of younger trees may mark the edge of an old storm. A group of older individuals may survive because logging missed them. Mapping can reveal order where none was intended, especially if the observer begins with the expectation of a centre. Place enough points on a map, and the human mind will find a wheel, a face, or possibly a rather disappointed duck. The claim becomes more useful when it asks whether fruiting patterns line up with human needs. Suppose several useful species in the same region provide harvests in a reliable sequence. Early berries arrive after winter stores are low. Summer fruit follows. Nuts and starchy seeds appear in autumn. Some remain on the tree into cold weather. Others store well. Wild animals become available in larger numbers during mast years because they too benefit from the food. Such a system could support people without annual fields covering the landscape. This seasonal sequence is not unusual in nature. Plants have different flowering and fruiting times because they evolved under different conditions and depend on different pollinators and seed dispersers. What would indicate management is a concentration of useful species beyond what local ecology would normally produce. If a forest contains trees imported from several climate zones, all placed where they grow well, and all contributing to a balanced harvest, deliberate design becomes more plausible. The same is true if local varieties show signs of selection for storage, yield, or staggered ripening. Old travel accounts sometimes describe forests where food seemed to appear continuously. Such records should be treated carefully. Travellers exaggerated. Translators changed meanings. A writer might describe a rich valley as endlessly fertile when they simply meant it was more productive than expected. Records were also shaped by the interests of rulers, merchants, missionaries, and colonizers. A forest full of useful plants could be presented as proof of divine generosity, evidence of a wealthy kingdom, or justification for taking control of apparently underused land. Even so, repeated descriptions of abundant woodland deserve attention. In parts of Europe, nuts from forests supported both people and livestock. Pigs were driven into oaken beechwoods during Mars seasons. Chestnuts were collected, dried, milled and stored. Fruit trees lined routes and settlement edges. Wild greens, mushrooms, berries, honey, game, and medicinal plants added to the yield. The forest was not a single crop, but it was still part of the food system. A person measuring only grain production might underestimate this contribution. Tree foods often entered households through informal gathering rather than taxed markets. Women, children, elders, and seasonal workers may have done much of the collecting, which meant official accounts recorded it poorly. Food eaten locally left fewer trade records. Livestock converted acorns and browse into meat without anyone weighing the original forest harvest. A state could therefore depend on woodland productivity while treating it as secondary or even unproductive land. When 19th century governments expanded control over forests, they often changed these relationships. Scientific forestry tended to favour measurable timber production. Mixed woodland could be replaced with more uniform stands. Grazing, gathering and burning were restricted because they interfered with tree growth or state ownership. Local use that had maintained open groves became illegal. Once people and animals stopped moving through the landscape, the canopy closed and the species balance changed. This creates an important problem for modern researchers. The forest visible today may not be the forest described in older records. If traditional management ended in the 19th century, more than a century of ecological succession has followed. Fruit trees may have died without replacement. Nut groves may have become shaded. Clearings may have disappeared. Species once concentrated near paths may now survive only as scattered individuals. Looking for an ancient food forest in its current condition may be like trying to understand a garden after the gate has been locked for 5 generations. The fencing itself can create the appearance of secrecy. A productive landscape becomes inaccessible just as its older use is fading. Officials remove local people, classify the land as protected, and limit collecting. Later generations are told that the area has always been wilderness. Anyone discovering an old map, a record of harvests, or an unusual fruit grove may conclude that something was deliberately erased. In some cases, local history was certainly suppressed or ignored. That does not automatically prove that authorities knew they were hiding ancient biological infrastructure. They may have been protecting timber, asserting ownership, controlling hunting, or applying a conservation model that excluded people. The result, however, can be the same. Knowledge disappears. The trees continue their cycles without the people who understood them. Heavy mast years become wildlife events rather than community harvests. Fruit falls and rots because collecting is forbidden. Old processing areas are overgrown. The forest is praised for producing abundance without human help, even though human selection may have shaped that abundance long before the current rules existed. Electromagnetic claims sometimes enter at this point. Supporters argue that synchronized fruiting over large areas cannot be explained by weather alone, and may involve electrical signals through roots, fungi, groundwater, or mineral-rich soils. Plants do produce electrical activity. Cells maintain voltage differences. Electrical signals can travel through plant tissues after injury or environmental change. Roots respond to moisture, minerals, and chemical gradients. Fungal networks also carry electrical pulses, although their meaning and role are still being studied. These facts make the subject interesting, but they do not establish an ancient control grid. Biological electricity is normal. Every living cell depends on electrical and chemical gradients. Measuring a signal does not tell us that someone designed it. Forest soils also vary in conductivity because of moisture, salt, minerals, organic matter, and temperature. Equipment can behave differently near magnetic rock or underground metal. Reliable claims require repeatable measurements, control sites, clear methods, and independent analysis. A single unusual reading taken beside an old tree may be worth noting, but it is not enough to rewrite agricultural history. There is a more grounded way to connect electrical behaviour with ancient management. People may have noticed practical effects linked to soil and water without understanding electricity. They may have recognised that certain trees performed better near springs, mineral soils, lava fields, or wetlands. They could arrange plantings according to these observations. Modern instruments might later detect unusual conductivity in the same places. The anomaly would be real, and the planting might be deliberate, but the explanation would not require advanced electrical technology. It would require patient observation passed through generations. The forest itself provides feedback. A tree fruits well in one location, so its seeds are planted nearby. Another fails repeatedly, so people stop trying. Mushrooms appear under a certain combination of trees, and those places are protected. Animals gather in a particular valley during mast years, so hunting and harvest routines develop around it. Over time, successful relationships are copied. The landscape becomes more productive without anyone needing a complete theory of how it works. That type of knowledge is often difficult to preserve in writing because it depends on conditions, and instructions such as "plant this tree here" may only make sense when paired with knowledge of slope, wind, soil smell, nearby fungi, animal roots, and the timing of rain. Remove the people who carry that context and the written fragment becomes useless. Later scholars may read a record of ceremonial planting and miss its agricultural purpose, or interpret a harvest festival as purely symbolic when it also organised labour around a mast cycle. Synchronized fruiting would have influenced more than food collection. It would affect animal populations, hunting, storage, trade, and settlement movement. A heavy acorn year could support more pigs and deer. A poor year could increase competition and hunger. Communities might preserve surplus, move livestock, or rely more heavily on other species. A food forest designed for resilience would therefore include plants with different cycles, rather than depending entirely on one synchronized crop. This is an important test for the theory. A well-designed system should not place every major food source on the same schedule. If all the nut trees fail together, the result is not resilience. It is a quiet forest and a very anxious village. Diversity protects against failure. Some plants respond differently to drought, frost, pests, and disease. Early varieties may succeed when late ones fail. Deep-rooted trees may continue during dry years. Wetland species may provide food after upland crops suffer. The most convincing ancient food forests would show overlapping systems, not perfect uniformity. Supporters sometimes describe synchronization as though the entire landscape produces on command. A more realistic model would contain several rhythms. Trees of the same species may mast together. Different species may have separate cycles. Human selection may spread harvests across the year. Storage extends the value of brief seasons. Animals convert forest foods into meat, milk, hides, and labour. People move between zones according to what is available. The system is coordinated not because every tree follows one signal, but because many cycles fit together well enough to support life. That kind of coordination can emerge through long use. A community does not need to design the whole forest in one generation. Each generation makes adjustments based on success and failure. One grove is expanded, another is abandoned. Seeds are exchanged with neighbouring regions. A cold-tolerant variety is moved uphill. A drought-resistant tree is planted near dry settlements. Over centuries, the resulting landscape may look as though it came from a single plane, even though it developed through thousands of local decisions. This may be where the phrase, "forgotten civilization," becomes too simple. The forest could be the work of many cultures, not one. A grove begins under one community, is expanded by another, adopted by a third, and later incorporated into a royal estate. Species arrive through trade, migration, marriage, pilgrimage, and war. Each group adds something. When the final users are removed, the entire layered history is reduced to the label ancient forest. The trees continue fruiting together because their biology remains intact. Their cycles may preserve traces of human selection, but they also follow climate and evolutionary pressure. The task is not to choose between nature and design as though only one can be present. A managed forest is both. Human decisions enter natural systems, and natural processes carry those decisions forward long after the original purpose has been forgotten. To know whether the groves were arranged deliberately, we would need to look below the visible harvest. Fruit and nuts are only the seasonal surface of a much larger system. The long-term stability of a forest depends on how water moves, how nutrients circulate, how roots occupy the soil, and how fungi connect plants across distances. Those hidden relationships determine whether a productive landscape can survive without constant rebuilding, and they lead directly to the most difficult claim of all, that beneath certain ancient forests there may still be an organized structure holding the whole system together. Beneath every forest is another forest that most visitors never see. It has no leaves, no birds, and no shafts of sunlight. It consists of roots, fungal threads, pockets of water, decaying wood, minerals, bacteria, insects, and small channels running through the soil. The visible forest depends on this underground layer for nearly everything. Trees may appear to stand as separate individuals, each occupying its own patch of ground, but below the surface their roots overlap. Fungi connect with several plants at once, and water moves through structures created by generations of growth and decay. To supporters of the ancient food forest theory, this hidden layer is more than ordinary ecology. They see it as the foundation of a biological system designed to remain productive long after the people who created it disappeared. The first problem with that claim is that underground forest systems are naturally complex. Roots do not need human planning to form networks. Fungi have been connecting with plants for hundreds of millions of years. Soil organisms recycle nutrients without waiting for instructions. Fallen trunks store water, roots strengthen slopes, and burrowing animals create channels that improve drainage and aeration. A forest can develop a highly organized underground structure through natural processes alone. Order does not always indicate a designer, especially when evolution has had an extremely long time to test arrangements that work. Even so, people can influence these systems. They can select where trees grow, move soil from established woodland to new planting areas, build terraces, place dead wood along slopes, guide springs, dig shallow channels, and encourage species whose roots occupy different depths. Once those actions are repeated across generations, the underground structure begins to preserve human decisions. The surface may later lose its paths and boundaries, but water can continue following old channels, soil can remain unusually fertile, and roots can grow through layers created by earlier management. A modern orchard usually separates trees into rows and keeps much of the ground between them open. This makes harvesting and machinery easier, but it also creates a relatively simple root environment. A forest-based system works differently. Tall trees may send deep roots towards stable moisture. Smaller trees occupy the middle soil layers. Shrubs use the upper ground. Herbs and grasses hold the surface. Fungi extend beyond the reach of individual roots and help plants gain access to nutrients. The system uses the soil vertically, just as the canopy uses sunlight at different heights. This arrangement can reduce direct competition if the species are well matched. Two plants with identical root patterns may compete strongly for the same water and minerals. Plants using different depths can share the same area more effectively. A deep-rooted tree may reach moisture during drought, while a shallow-rooted plant benefits from light rain. Some roots break compacted soil, others spread widely and protect the surface from erosion. When leaves and branches fall, the nutrients gathered from deeper layers return to the upper soil. Ancient managers did not need modern soil science to observe these effects. They could see which plants remained healthy together, which trees improved the ground around them, and which combinations failed. A person might not know the chemical form of phosphorus, but could notice that seedlings grew better where certain leaves accumulated. They might not understand fungal symbiosis, but could observe that particular mushrooms appeared near productive trees. Knowledge developed through repeated experience can be precise, even when the explanation behind it is incomplete. Mycorrhizal fungi are central to the hidden system. These fungi form relationships with plant roots, receiving sugars from the plant and helping it absorb water and nutrients. Their thread-like structures, known as hyphae, spread through soil far beyond the immediate root surface. They increase the area from which a plant can draw resources, sometimes connecting several plants at once. Different fungal species associate with different trees, and the resulting networks can influence growth, disease resistance, and the movement of nutrients through the forest. Popular accounts often describe these networks as an underground internet. The comparison is useful because it explains connection, but it can also create the wrong impression. Trees are not sending written messages or deciding collectively which sapling deserves financial support. Nutrients and chemical signals move according to biological processes, environmental conditions, and the interest of the organisms involved. Fungi are not neutral cables. They are living organisms seeking their own advantage, and the exchange between fungi and plants can shift depending on supply, demand, stress, and competition. The existence of these networks does not prove ancient engineering. What it does show is that a forest can function as an interconnected system rather than a random collection of separate trees. If people wanted to create a durable food-producing landscape, preserving and strengthening fungal relationships would be useful. They might do this without consciously recognizing the full network. Avoiding deep ploughing, keeping living roots in the soil, moving leaf litter, limiting destructive fire, and transplanting young trees with soil from older groves could all support fungal communities. Some traditional planting practices involve carrying soil from a healthy tree to a new one. The practical reasoning may be expressed in ordinary terms. The old soil is considered strong, mature, blessed, or suitable. Modern biology may identify fungal spores and microorganisms as part of the benefit. A practice can preserve useful ecological relationships without the people following it, describing those relationships scientifically. This possibility is important when examining stories about sacred groves. Certain forest areas were protected from cutting, grazing, or ordinary gathering. These restrictions may have had religious meaning, but they could also preserve old trees, seed sources, soil organisms, and water. A grove left undisturbed at the centre of a managed landscape could act as a biological reserve. Seeds, fungi, insects, and birds would spread from it into surrounding areas. The sacred boundary may therefore have protected both a cultural place and the ecological foundation of the wider system. Supporters of the food forest theory sometimes interpret central old groves as control points. They argue that the oldest trees served as hubs from which roots, fungi, and younger plantings spread outward. The idea becomes more dramatic when electromagnetic claims are added. Measurements of electrical activity in roots and fungi are presented as evidence that ancient designers used living networks to coordinate growth or fruiting. Some versions describe the underground system almost as though it were a biological machine. Plants do generate electrical signals. Their cells maintain voltage differences across membranes, and changes in those voltages can travel through tissues. Damage, light, temperature, water stress, and chemical changes can trigger electrical responses. Fungi also show electrical activity, including pulses measured along their networks. Researchers are studying what these patterns mean and how they relate to growth, resource movement, and environmental response. None of this establishes that ancient people programmed forests through electricity. The current evidence supports biological signaling, not an engineered communication system operating according to a human design. A measurable electrical pulse may indicate stress, growth, injury, or ordinary cellular activity. It does not automatically indicate a coded instruction. The distinction is similar to hearing a sound inside a machine. The sound proves movement, but it does not tell you who built the machine or whether it was built at all. Mineral-rich soils can further complicate measurements. Moisture, salts, metal ores, volcanic rock, buried human objects, and changing temperature all affect electrical conductivity. A forest growing over lava may produce different readings from one growing over sand or limestone. Groundwater can create conductive pathways. Decaying organic matter alters soil chemistry. Equipment placed in such environments needs careful calibration, repeated testing, and comparison with nearby control sites. Without those steps, an anomaly may be real but impossible to interpret. The more persuasive evidence for underground design is physical rather than electromagnetic. Terraces, drainage systems, soil modification, and the deliberate placement of trees can survive in measurable ways. Low ridges may direct water across a slope. Shallow basins may collect leaf litter and moisture. Buried charcoal can improve soil structure and nutrient retention. Stones placed along contours can slow erosion. Old pits may have been used for composting, storage, or planting. None of these features is as dramatic as a hidden energy network, but they are more consistent with known human practices. Water management would have been essential to any large food forest. Trees survive drought better than many annual crops, but young trees are vulnerable, and fruit production often depends on reliable moisture. A productive landscape needs ways to slow water, spread it, and store it in soil. Ancient communities around the world built canals, terraces, ponds, wells, and drainage systems. In wooded landscapes, they may have used less visible methods. Fallen logs placed across slopes hold sediment. Small ditches redirect runoff. Stone lines reduce erosion. Ponds create moist zones for different plants. Dense ground cover protects the soil from heat. Over time, these structures blend into the landscape. A channel fills with leaves, roots grow along its edges, and animals enlarge or redirect it. A terrace collapses partly but still slows water. A pond becomes a wet hollow. Later visitors may classify the features as natural because they no longer have clean edges. Remote sensing and detailed elevation mapping can sometimes reveal patterns hidden beneath vegetation, but interpretation remains difficult. A straight line in a forest may be a road, a boundary, a drainage feature, a geological fault, or the result of logging. Tree roots can preserve and alter these structures at the same time. Roots strengthen soil, making a terrace or bank last longer. As they grow, they also break stone, lift surfaces, and change water flow. When a tree falls, its root plate creates a pit and mound. Repeated over centuries, this process makes the ground uneven and can erase shallow archaeological features. The forest protects evidence by covering it, then destroys evidence by growing through it. Soil chemistry may provide clearer clues. Long-term human occupation often increases phosphorus and changes the distribution of charcoal, organic matter, and microscopic remains. Food processing, animal keeping, waste disposal, burning, and composting leave chemical traces. Even when buildings disappear, the soil can retain a record of repeated activity. In a food forest, areas used for storage, cooking, animal shelter, or intensive planting may show patterns different from surrounding woodland. One especially important form of modified soil is found in parts of the Amazon. Dark, fertile soils created by past communities contain charcoal, organic waste, pottery fragments, and other materials. These soils remain productive long after their creators are gone. Their existence shows that people can build lasting fertility into a landscape rather than relying entirely on naturally rich ground. It also shows how biological infrastructure and human settlement can become physically inseparable. Charcoal is useful because it decomposes slowly. When incorporated into soil, it can improve water retention and provide surfaces for microorganisms. Ancient people may have created charcoal-rich soils intentionally, accidentally, or through practices that combined both. Cooking fires, controlled burning, waste disposal, and soil preparation can all contribute. Once established, such soils can support plants for centuries, giving later observers the impression that the location is naturally more fertile than the land around it. European forests also contain charcoal platforms, old hearths, mining pits, boundary banks, hollow ways, and traces of woodland industries. These features show that forests often supported intensive economic activity, even when they now appear quiet. Charcoal burners, resin collectors, herders, hunters, woodcutters, beekeepers, and gatherers use the same landscape in different seasons. A forest could produce timber, fuel, meat, honey, nuts, fruit, medicine, and animal fodder without being cleared completely. The underground traces of these activities are rarely arranged like the foundations of a city. They are scattered, repeated, and closely tied to terrain. That makes them easy to overlook. Archaeological surveys often focus on large monuments or permanent settlements. A network of shallow pits, low banks, and modified soils may seem unimportant until it is mapped as a whole. The same is true of plant distributions. One fruit tree means little. Hundreds aligned with old water features and paths may mean something more. Root grafting adds another natural process that can make forests appear engineered. Roots of neighbouring trees, especially those of the same species, can sometimes grow together. Once connected, they may exchange water, nutrients, or carbohydrates. A stump can remain alive because nearby trees support its root system. Groups of trees may therefore function with a degree of physical connection. This can improve survival in some circumstances, though it may also spread disease. To an observer expecting each tree to be independent, root grafts can look like deliberate plumbing. In reality, they can arise naturally when roots press together and their tissues join. Human planting could increase the likelihood by placing compatible trees close together, but there is no need to assume that every graft was planned. The useful question is whether ancient managers noticed the effect. They may have understood that clustered trees survived better, or that cutting one affected others nearby. Practical forestry often develops from such observations. Another hidden component is hydraulic redistribution. Deep-rooted plants can sometimes move water from moist lower soil into drier upper layers through their roots, especially at night when transpiration is reduced. Nearby shallow-rooted plants may benefit from the redistributed moisture. This process creates a natural form of underground water sharing. A food forest containing deep and shallow-rooted species could therefore remain productive through dry periods more effectively than a simple field. Ancient people would not have measured the pressure inside roots, but they could have observed which plants remained green near certain trees. A large tree might be associated with herbs, berries, or fungi that survived drought. Protecting that tree would preserve more than shade. It could support a local moisture system. Over generations, people might build planting rules around these associations. Nitrogen-fixing plants provide another example. Certain trees and shrubs form relationships with bacteria that convert atmospheric nitrogen into forms plants can use. Growing these species near fruit and nut trees can improve soil fertility. Modern agroforestry uses this principle deliberately. Traditional systems may have done the same through observation. A community could notice that soil remained productive near particular shrubs, or that cut leaves from those plants improved growth elsewhere. The strongest food forest designs would combine many such functions. Some species provide food directly, others improve soil, attract pollinators, repel pests, support fungi, produce mulch, hold slopes, or move water. A visitor focused only on edible plants might overlook half the system. The tree producing no obvious food may be essential because it protects young fruit trees from wind. A thorny shrub may guard seedlings from grazing animals. A plant considered useless may flower during a gap when pollinators need nectar. This functional layering is why unusual species combinations attract attention. When several plants provide complementary services, the group can look designed. Yet natural ecosystems also contain complementary relationships. Species that survive together often do so because they occupy different niches or benefit indirectly from one another. The evidence for human arrangement must therefore come from distribution, genetics, historical records, and comparison with unmanaged sites. If a species grows far outside its expected natural range, human transport becomes more likely. If several useful species from different regions appear together near an old route or settlement, the case strengthens. If their genetics show selection for food traits, stronger still. The underground evidence may then explain how the introduced system survived. Modified soil, water structures, charcoal, and fungal communities could maintain productivity after planting stopped. Restricted access can make this kind of research difficult. Protected forests often limit excavation, root sampling, and soil disturbance, because the work can damage rare species or spread disease. Border zones and military areas add further restrictions. Researchers may receive permission for narrow studies that cannot examine the wider pattern. This creates gaps that speculative theories readily fill. It is reasonable to question restrictions, but the presence of a locked gate is not evidence of hidden infrastructure. Ancient forests are vulnerable to trampling, illegal collecting, fire, invasive species, and damage from uncontrolled tourism. Some root systems lie near the surface. A large increase in visitors can compact soil and harm trees. Conservation rules may be frustrating without being deceptive. The more serious historical concern is that restrictions often removed local people while allowing officials, nobles, companies, or approved scientists to continue using the land. Access was not simply stopped, it was redistributed. A community that gathered food and managed fire could be labelled destructive, while commercial logging received permission under a management plan. A royal hunt could continue in a forest closed to villagers. Later, conservation may have protected the same landscape, while forgetting the inequality built into its boundaries. When those communities were excluded, their knowledge of underground conditions was rarely recorded in scientific terms. They knew where the soil stayed moist, where trees failed, which springs changed after cutting, and which fungi indicated healthy ground. Such knowledge may have been encoded in place names, seasonal rules, stories, and work routines. Once the language of management changed, officials may have treated these observations as superstition or local habit. A story about a tree that should never be cut may preserve knowledge of erosion. A warning against digging in a certain grove may protect shallow roots or a water source. A ritual involving the transfer of soil may preserve fungi. A rule about leaving fallen wood may maintain moisture and habitat. Not every tradition has an ecological purpose, but dismissing all of them can erase practical information gathered over centuries. The theory of hidden architecture is strongest when it treats the forest as accumulated work rather than a buried machine. Roots, fungi, water, soil, and human decisions interact over long periods. The architecture is not fixed. It grows, breaks, repairs itself, and changes its own layout. It can survive partial neglect because living components reproduce. It can also lose its original function gradually without any clear moment of collapse. A stone aqueduct either carries water or it does not. A biological water system may become less efficient over several generations while still functioning well enough to seem natural. A planted grove may lose some useful species but retain others. Fungal networks reorganize. Roots enter old channels. Animals spread plants beyond original boundaries. The system drifts away from its design while preserving parts of it. That makes proof difficult. Researchers may never find a single feature that settles the question. Instead, the case would depend on many small signs fitting together. Tree genetics, soil chemistry, charcoal layers, water patterns, old maps, place names, pollen records, root structures, and oral histories would need to support the same interpretation. The result might reveal a landscape shaped by several communities over thousands of years rather than one lost civilization. This layered explanation is less dramatic, but it may be more important. It suggests that ancient people built infrastructure that modern societies fail to recognize because it was distributed across living systems. They did not need metal pipes if roots moved water. They did not need artificial fertilizer if nutrient-fixing plants and animals maintained soil. They did not need warehouses for every crop if nuts remained on trees or could be stored in cool pits. They did not need to rebuild the system annually if most of its productive structure was perennial. The forest could therefore preserve a form of engineering based on maintenance rather than control. People worked with processes that were already present. Their success depended on understanding limits, seasons, and relationships. When they disappeared, the system continued because it had never depended on a single machine or central operator. To later governments and foresters, however, such a landscape could appear unplanned. Its value might be measured mainly in timber. Mixed species could be replaced with uniform stands. Wet areas could be drained. Fallen wood could be removed. Local burning could be banned. Old paths could be closed. Each change might seem rational within a modern management system while weakening the older one. If the food forests were erased, the erasure may not have begun with cutting every tree. It may have begun by changing what the forest was believed to be. Once officials classified it as timberland, hunting reserve, national park, or pristine wilderness, earlier functions became harder to see. The underground architecture remained, but the human explanation was removed. The next evidence therefore cannot be found only in roots and soil. It must also be found in records. Maps, travel accounts, harvest lists, village documents, forestry laws, court cases, and local names may reveal how these landscapes were used before they were fenced and renamed. Some of those records describe food, grazing, gathering, and settlements in places later presented as untouched. Others show how quickly access changed during the 19th century. Following those traces takes us away from the forest floor and into archives where old harvests, abandoned routes, and vanished keepers can still be found. Old maps are often treated as windows into the past, but they are better understood as arguments about the past. A map tells us what its maker considered important enough to record. It shows roads used by officials, borders recognised by governments, estates claimed by landowners, rivers useful for transport, and settlements large enough to deserve a name. It may show a forest as a dark green block with a label written across it, giving the impression that everything inside that boundary was one continuous, unchanging wilderness. What it usually does not show is where villagers gathered nuts, which clearings produced berries, where pigs were taken during autumn mast, which springs remained open in dry weather, or which families cared for particular groves. A map can be accurate about ownership while saying almost nothing about use. This matters because the theory of ancient food forests depends heavily on landscapes being misclassified. If a wooded area was managed through seasonal gathering, selective cutting, controlled burning, grazing, seed movement, and protection of useful trees, a conventional map might still label the whole place simply as forest. The people using it would recognise dozens of separate zones. One slope might be known for chestnuts, another for mushrooms, a wet hollow for medicinal plants, and a sunny edge for fruit. A distant clearing might be visited only once a year. Another area might remain closed for several seasons to allow animals or plants to recover. None of that complexity would necessarily appear on a surveyor's sheet. Modern readers often assume that blank space indicates empty land. Historically, blank space usually indicates missing information. The surveyor may not have entered the area. Local names may not have been translated. Seasonal use may have been ignored because it did not fit legal definitions of occupation. Communal rights were especially difficult to record. A village might not own the forest in the modern sense, yet families could possess recognised rights to gather wood, graze animals, collect resin, maintain beehives, cut fodder, or harvest particular trees. These rights might be divided by season, household, age, or custom. To an outsider, the arrangement could look informal. To the people living under it, it was a detailed system with rules, penalties, and long memories. The records that survive are therefore scattered. Evidence of forest food does not always appear in books about agriculture. It may be found in court disputes over acorn collection, taxes on chestnut flour, payments for woodland grazing, lists of household tools, monastery accounts, hunting regulations, or complaints about strangers cutting fruit trees. A legal document may mention a grove only because two neighbours argued about it. A ruler may record a harvest because it was taxed. An estate manager may list nut production beside timber income. These fragments rarely describe a complete food system, but when they are placed together, they show that forests contributed far more to daily survival than later histories sometimes admit. In parts of Europe, autumn mast was a major resource. Pigs were driven into oaken beechwoods to feed on fallen acorns and nuts. This practice reduced the need to store large quantities of animal feed and converted forest production into meat and fat. The value of a woodland could therefore depend not only on its timber, but on how many animals it could support during a good year. Rights to this grazing were often regulated carefully. Fees were collected, dates were fixed, and access was restricted to particular communities. A forest managed in this way was producing food even when people did not eat most of the tree crop directly. Chestnut landscapes were even more clearly agricultural. In suitable regions, chestnuts were gathered in large quantities, dried, stored, and milled into flour. Trees were grafted, pruned, protected, and replaced. Different varieties could be selected for early ripening, storage, taste, or resistance to local conditions. A mature grove required long-term planning because the best yields arrived years after planting. Yet to someone passing through outside the harvest season, the same place could look like ordinary woodland. Hazelnuts, walnuts, apples, pears, plums, berries, honey, mushrooms, herbs, bark, roots, and leafy fodder added further layers. Some were traded, others were consumed locally and left little formal record. Food collected by children, women, herders, and older family members was especially likely to disappear from official accounts. Administrators tended to record products that could be taxed, sold, or measured. A basket of berries eaten at home did not trouble the treasury, and therefore seldom troubled the historian. Honey offers a useful example of how easily forest production can be overlooked. In many regions, beekeeping was tied closely to woodland. Bees used tree hollows or managed hives placed among flowering plants. Honey provided sweetness, medicine, preservation, and fermented drink. Wax was valuable for candles, seals, and religious use. A forest containing old bee trees, flowering understory plants, and protected clearings could support a specialised economy without resembling farmland. When later forestry focused on straight timber trunks, hollow trees and flowering edges might be treated as defects rather than assets. Białowieża forest contains a long history of changing access and use. It became strongly associated with royal hunting and later state protection, but this did not mean that human activity was absent. People lived around the forest, entered it for specific purposes, maintained routes, gathered resources, managed meadows, and performed specialised work. Certain forms of use were permitted, while others were limited. The forest was protected because it was valuable, not because no one knew it existed. That distinction is important. Protection can preserve an ecosystem while also concentrating power. A ruler who reserves a forest for hunting prevents some forms of exploitation, but does not create a human-free landscape. Workers still maintain roads, care for animals, collect products, and support the estate. Nearby communities may retain old rights or lose them gradually. Later generations may remember the hunting reserve but forget the ordinary labour that kept it functioning. Old maps of such places often emphasise boundaries, hunting grounds, forestry divisions and administrative routes. Earlier seasonal patterns are harder to recover. A meadow inside a forest may appear as an opening without explanation. A line of trees may mark a vanished track. A cluster of fruiting species may stand near a settlement removed generations ago. Unless researchers compare maps from different periods, the older structure remains hidden beneath the later one. Place names can preserve information after physical evidence becomes difficult to see. A name may refer to nuts, bees, apples, grazing, burning, springs, mills, animals, or a family responsible for a particular area. The meaning can become obscure when languages change or populations move. Officials may standardize spelling, translate a local term incorrectly, or replace it with a name that better suits a new administrative system. Once that happens, a practical description can become a meaningless label. Imagine a clearing known for centuries as the place of the sweet chestnuts. The original community is removed, the language declines, and a surveyor writes a version of the name that no longer carries its meaning. A later map shows only a forest compartment number. The trees remain, but the instruction attached to them has been lost. Anyone studying the grove must now reconstruct its purpose from genetics, soil, and scattered documents. Japan offers similar difficulties. Mountain and forest use was often connected to the village rights and shared management. Communities gathered fuel, leaf litter, timber, mushrooms, plants, and animal fodder from wooded areas. Some land was held or used collectively under arrangements that did not match modern private property. People knew where to cut, when to gather, and which areas required rest. These systems could be highly organised without producing the kind of permanent structures that dominate archaeological surveys. When centralised administration, commercial forestry and modern property law expanded, older rights were frequently redefined. A village that had used a mountain for generations might be required to prove ownership through documents created under a new legal system. Customary access could become unauthorised access. Shared land could become state forest. Practices once essential to local life could be restricted as inefficient, damaging, or difficult to regulate. The resulting forest might become denser after regular cutting and gathering stopped. Species associated with open woodland could decline. Paths would close. Productive edges would disappear beneath shade. Later visitors might see the dense vegetation and assume that the area had always looked that way. In reality, the forest they admired could be the result of abandoned management rather than the absence of management. Yakushima's ancient cedars are often discussed mainly in terms of age, climate, logging, and conservation. Those subjects are important, but they can overshadow the broader human landscape. Mountain forests were not isolated from coastal settlements. Timber moved downhill. People travelled through the interior. Religious practice shaped access to certain places. Different zones experienced different levels of use. The surviving old trees are not a simple sample of untouched nature. They are also survivors of geography, value, custom, and historical decisions about where cutting was practical or permitted. Aokigahara presents a different archival problem because dramatic stories about the forest often replace its ordinary history. Maps of lava flows, routes, caves, and village boundaries can reveal far more than modern legends. Forests growing on volcanic ground develop according to soil depth, cracks, moisture, and repeated disturbance. If useful plants appear in unusual combinations, researchers must ask whether they were introduced, spread from nearby settlements, or simply found favourable conditions. Old records of gathering and travel would help, but sensational reputation tends to attract more attention than tax lists or village agreements. Across North America, early survey maps and field notes sometimes provide clues that later maps omit. Surveyors recorded witness trees to mark corners and boundaries, Their notes can reveal which species dominated particular locations at the time. They also describe prairies, open woods, trails, burned areas, orchards, settlements, and groves. These documents are valuable, but they were produced during a period of rapid disruption. Indigenous populations had already been reduced or displaced in many regions, and traditional burning and harvesting practices were being interrupted. A landscape encountered by a surveyor was therefore not necessarily a landscape untouched by people. It may have been changing because the people who maintained it were gone. Open oak woodland could begin filling with younger trees. Berry grounds could shrink without fire. Old trails could remain visible while the settlements they connected had disappeared. A surveyor might describe the land as naturally open or naturally wooded without knowing the management history that produced it. Travel accounts can help, but they introduce their own problems. Visitors often misunderstood what they saw. They exaggerated abundance, danger, emptiness, or fertility depending on the story they wanted to tell. A merchant might emphasize resources. A missionary might describe a landscape in moral terms. A military officer might focus on routes and obstacles. A colonist seeking land might present an inhabited region as underused. Descriptions of food growing without cultivation are therefore ambiguous. They may refer to genuinely wild abundance, old orchards, managed woodland, or simply agriculture that the observer failed to recognize. A traveller who saw people gathering nuts rather than sowing grain might conclude that nature provided everything. The years of pruning, burning, transplanting, and protecting useful species would remain invisible. The word wild often reveals more about the observer than the landscape. A plant is called wild when its human relationship is not understood. A forest is called wild when its management does not resemble familiar farming. A population is called wandering when its movement follows a seasonal system outsiders cannot read. These labels simplify administration, but they can erase knowledge. Records of harvest disputes are especially revealing because conflict forces people to explain their claims. A court case may state that a family has gathered from a grove for generations. A village may object when a landowner blocks a path used during nut season. Herders may defend access to marsh grounds. Beekeepers may protest the cutting of hollow trees. Such documents show that the forest was divided by use even when the official map showed one property. Enclosure changed these relationships. Fences, surveyed boundaries, and legal titles turned flexible customary systems into fixed parcels. A person who once possessed a seasonal right could lose it because the right did not equal ownership under the new law. Forest products that had supported households became the property of the state or estate owner. Gathering became theft. Grazing became trespass. Controlled burning became destruction. Once these activities stopped, the evidence of them faded. A nut harvest leaves no ruined warehouse if the nuts were carried home in baskets. Woodland grazing leaves little trace after the animals are excluded. A berry patch may disappear when shade increases. A bee tree collapses. A coppiced grove grows into irregular trunks. Within a few generations, officials can claim that the forest has returned to its natural state, although the new condition may be unlike anything the former community knew. The keepers vanished in several ways. Some were formally expelled. Others lost access gradually through fees, permits, and restrictions. Economic change drew younger people into towns and factories. War emptied villages. Disease reduced populations. Borders divided communities from their customary land. New forestry departments replaced local authority with trained professionals. Each process removed part of the knowledge needed to read the landscape. Professional forestry brought valuable methods for measuring growth, planning harvests, and preventing uncontrolled cutting. It also tended to define forest value in terms that governments could count. Timber volume, annual yield, species composition, and revenue fit neatly into reports. Seasonal gathering, spiritual obligations, household food, and collective rights were harder to calculate. What could not be measured easily was often treated as marginal. Mixed forests were sometimes simplified into stands of commercially valuable trees. Understory plants were cleared. Dead wood was removed. Wet areas were drained. Grazing and burning were prohibited. From the perspective of timber production, these changes could seem efficient. From the perspective of a food forest, they could dismantle the system while leaving many trees standing. This is why erased food forests may not look erased. The canopy remains, and perhaps it even becomes denser. Officials point to the trees as proof that the landscape was protected. Yet the edible shrubs are shaded out. The fruit trees are no longer pruned. The paths to gathering areas disappear, and animal movement changes. The forest survives biologically while losing its former human function. Old photographs can capture this transition. Early images of places now densely wooded sometimes show open groves, grazed edges, low vegetation, scattered mature trees, and signs of regular use. Later photographs show thick regeneration. Without explanation, viewers may assume the earlier condition was degraded and the later one restored. That may be correct in some cases, but not all. Open woodland can be a stable, diverse, and productive system maintained through human activity. Maps made decades apart can reveal settlement removal. A village appears on one sheet and disappears from the next. Fields become forest compartments. Paths lose their names. Orchards are absorbed into a protected zone. Cemeteries remain as isolated symbols or vanish entirely. The change looks neat on paper because maps do not record the difficulty of leaving. Local oral history can fill some gaps. People remember gathering places, old varieties, springs, abandoned homes, and rules about particular trees. Such memories must be handled carefully because stories change, and later theories can influence what people recall. Even so, oral history can direct researchers toward physical evidence. A remembered walnut grove can be mapped. A story about a lost village can be compared with soil and elevation data. A traditional harvest date can be checked against the biology of local species. One of the most valuable clues is the survival of old cultivars in apparently wild settings. A fruit tree may produce an unusual variety not found in modern orchards. A chestnut may show signs of grafting. A pear may grow near the remains of a track with no current settlement nearby. Genetic analysis can determine whether these trees are related to cultivated populations or local wild stock. A single tree proves little. People discard fruit seeds, and animals spread them. A broad pattern is more significant. If several useful species occur together near vanished settlements, old paths, modified soils, and water features, the interpretation shifts. The forest begins to look less like random regrowth and more like the remains of a managed landscape. The theory becomes weaker when every old tree is treated as evidence of a lost global system. Local history is usually sufficient to explain abandoned orchards and managed groves. Monasteries planted trees, estates created parks. Villages moved. Trade routes carried seeds. Soldiers and travellers introduced plants. These known processes can create unusual combinations without requiring a forgotten civilization. The more interesting question is whether known communities practiced food forest management on a scale historians have underestimated. They may not have left monumental cities beneath every canopy, but they could have maintained broad networks of groves, clearings, grazing areas, and water systems. Their infrastructure would be distributed rather than centralized. Maps focused on buildings and ownership would fail to capture it. This possibility also changes the meaning of old harvest records. A list of chestnuts, honey, pigs, berries, and wood may look like a collection of minor rural products. Together they may describe an integrated economy. Nuts feed people and animals fertilize land, bees pollinate trees, leaf litter supports fields, wood provides heat and tools. Mushrooms and herbs add food and medicine. The forest is not separate from agriculture. It is one part of a wider system. When the parts are recorded in different documents, the system disappears from view. Timber appears in forestry records. Pigs appear in livestock accounts. Honey appears in trade lists. Fruit appears in household inventories. Grazing rights appear in legal cases. No single archive labels them as one designed landscape, so later historians may study each separately. Reconstructing the whole system requires patience and cooperation across fields. Historians must read forestry documents alongside village records. Ecologists must compare current species with older maps. Archaeologists must search for low earthworks rather than only buildings. Geneticists must test old trees. Linguists must examine place names. Local communities must be treated as sources of knowledge rather than obstacles to access. The result may not support every claim made by the ancient food forest theory. It may show a mixture of natural forest, ordinary agriculture, royal management, commercial forestry, and local gathering. That complexity is more likely than a single explanation. Yet complexity does not make the earlier use unimportant. A landscape can be shaped by many generations without any one group designing all of it. The vanished keepers may therefore have been numerous. They included herders, beekeepers, fruit growers, hunters, charcoal makers, healers, monks, estate workers, indigenous fire practitioners, village elders, and children who learned where particular foods grew. Their knowledge was distributed just like the forest itself. No one person needed to understand the entire system. Each knew a part. Removing those people removed the system's memory. The trees could continue growing, but the timing, roots, rules, and purposes were no longer maintained. A forest without its keepers is like a library whose books remain while the language needed to read them is forgotten. The material survives, but its arrangement becomes difficult to interpret. By the middle of the 19th century, governments had developed new tools for turning these complicated landscapes into controlled territory. Surveying became more precise, forestry became professionalized, property categories hardened, railways increased the value of timber, conservation and hunting laws expanded, shared access became easier to restrict. Villages that had used forest through custom were increasingly required to obey rules written elsewhere. These changes did not occur in exactly the same way or for one secret purpose. They followed industrial demand, state expansion, colonial policy, elite interests, scientific ideas, and genuine concern about environmental destruction. Still, the timing is difficult to ignore because many older forest relationships were broken within a few decades. The maps became clearer just as the history on the ground became harder to see, and the next step was the broad enclosure of landscapes that had never been as empty or unmanaged as the new boundaries suggested. By the middle of the 19th century, the relationship between governments and forests was changing quickly. Woodlands that had once been used through local custom were being measured, divided, registered, and brought under tighter administrative control. Surveyors arrived with chains, notebooks, boundary stones, and a confidence that every piece of land could be assigned a clear owner and a clear purpose. Foresters counted trunks and estimated timber. Officials drew lines around hunting grounds, watersheds, military zones, and future reserves. Activities that had taken place for generations without formal permission were redefined as privileges, licenses, or offences. A person who had always gathered fallen branches could suddenly be accused of stealing state property, which must have been surprising news to both the person and the branches. Supporters of the erased food forest theory see the period between roughly 1850 and 1900 as the critical turning point. They argue that governments across Europe, Japan and North America enclosed wooded landscapes at a similar time, restricted local access, removed or displaced communities, and then described the resulting forests as untouched wilderness. In the strongest version of the theory, this was a coordinated effort to conceal the remains of ancient biological infrastructure. The forests were fenced because authorities had discovered that they were not natural at all, but highly productive systems created by an earlier civilization. Public access was restricted so that ordinary people would not notice the unusual species combinations, old waterworks, synchronized harvests, or buried structures beneath the roots. That version makes an effective mystery, but it asks us to accept a level of international coordination for which clear evidence has not been established. 19th century governments did communicate, copy one another's policies, exchange scientific ideas, and watch foreign institutions closely. They did not, however, operate as one unified body. European empires competed with each other. Japan was undergoing rapid political and industrial transformation. The United States and Canada were expanding state authority across large territories while removing indigenous communities. Laws were inconsistent, enforcement was uneven, and government departments regularly disagreed about matters far less complicated than hiding the agricultural system of a forgotten civilization. A more grounded explanation begins with industrialization. Factories, railways, mines, ships, expanding cities, and growing armies required enormous quantities of timber. Wood was used for fuel, construction, railway sleepers, mine supports, tools, furniture, paper, packaging, and charcoal. Even where coal was becoming more important, wood remained essential. Forests that had supported local communities through mixed uses were increasingly viewed as national resources. Governments wanted to know how much timber they contained, how quickly it could be harvested, and how reliably it could be replaced. Scientific forestry developed partly in response to fears that timber supplies were being exhausted. Foresters promoted planned cutting, regulated regrowth, and detailed inventories. These methods could protect forests from uncontrolled commercial destruction, but they also encouraged a narrower definition of value. A tree that produced fruit, shade, habitat, fodder, and fuel for local households might be judged mainly by the quality of its trunk. Mixed woodland could be considered inefficient because different species grew at different rates and produced materials that were difficult to standardize. A uniform stand of commercially useful trees was easier to measure, manage, and sell. The old food-producing functions of the forest did not necessarily disappear immediately. People continued gathering nuts, berries, mushrooms, herbs, bark, and fallen wood where they were allowed. Animals still grazed beneath trees. Beekeepers still relied on woodland flowers. Yet these activities now competed with the priorities of state foresters and private companies. Grazing could damage seedlings intended for timber production. Gathering leaf litter removed nutrients that foresters wanted to remain in the soil. Controlled burning threatened plantations. Cutting small poles interfered with planned growth. Each local practice could be presented as harmful when examined from the perspective of a single commercial objective. This shift did not require officials to understand or destroy an ancient food forest deliberately. They only needed to measure the landscape according to a new purpose. Once timber became the primary value, the rest of the system became interference. A chestnut grove might still feed people, but if another species produced straighter boards, the chestnuts could be considered a poor use of land. An open oak woodland might support pigs, grasses, insects, and gathering, but a dense plantation could produce more saleable wood per hectare. Efficiency depended on what the official report was designed to count. Property law changed alongside forestry. In many regions, customary rights had existed without individual ownership of the land. Families could collect certain products, communities could graze animals, and villages could use woods according to seasonal rules. These arrangements were often detailed, but they did not fit easily into modern legal categories. Surveying and registration demanded fixed boundaries and named owners. Shared use became difficult to record because several people might possess different rights in the same place. When land was enclosed, the people who depended on it did not always lose everything at once. Restrictions accumulated. A permit became necessary. Fees increased. Harvest dates narrowed. Certain tools were banned. Grazing limits were introduced. Guards were appointed. A practice that remained technically legal could become so difficult that families abandoned it. A fence did not need to surround every kilometre of forest. A boundary on a map supported by patrols and penalties could be enough. Physical fencing carried powerful meaning though. It transformed a familiar landscape into controlled territory. Gates directed movement. Signs explained who belonged and who did not. Roads used by local people became service routes for officials, hunters, soldiers, or timber workers. Communities that had treated the forest as part of daily life were required to approach it as visitors. The timing of these changes is one reason the theory remains attractive. Similar transformations occurred in many countries during the same broad period. Yet similar outcomes can result from similar pressures. Industrial states wanted taxes, resources, maps, and control. Railways opened remote land to markets. Professional bureaucracies expanded. New conservation ideas spread. Colonial governments wanted to replace local authority with central administration. Elite hunting interests sought exclusive access. The policies did not need to originate from a secret agreement, because the political and economic conditions were already pushing governments in the same direction. Europe had a long history of woodland regulation before 1850. Royal forests, noble estates, monastic lands, communal woods and private properties already carried restrictions. What changed during the 19th century was the scale and precision of administration. Modern states gained the ability to survey larger territories, enforce uniform rules, and train professional foresters. Older customary arrangements were increasingly judged against written law. A community might have used a woodland for centuries, but still lose a dispute if it could not produce the kind of title recognised by the state. In some regions, enclosure had begun much earlier, particularly on agricultural commons. The 19th century continued and extended that process into forests, uplands, and marginal land. Areas that had supported grazing, gathering, and seasonal movement were divided or assigned to new owners. The result was not only economic, it changed the ecology. When animals stopped grazing, young trees spread into open ground. When people no longer gathered fuel, dead material accumulated. When coppicing ended, multi-stemmed woodland grew into taller, denser stands. When burning was prohibited, fire-sensitive vegetation expanded. A few decades later, the changed landscape could be presented as natural recovery. Sometimes it was recovery from heavy exploitation. In other cases, it was the decline of a cultural ecosystem that depended on regular human disturbance. Both processes could happen in neighbouring areas, which makes simple stories unreliable. Białowieża illustrates the difficulty of separating protection from power. The forest's long association with elite hunting helped prevent complete conversion to farmland and intensive timber production. That protection contributed to the survival of old trees and large animals. It also limited ordinary access and tied the forest to rulers, states, borders, and political change. Different administrations altered how it was used, who could enter, and which activities were permitted. Protection preserved extraordinary ecological value, but it did not place the forest outside history. The food forest theory interprets the restriction of such places as evidence that authorities recognized hidden productivity. A less dramatic reading is that rulers protected game and timber, while later governments protected biodiversity, strategic territory, or national heritage. These motives are well within the ordinary behaviour of states. Still, ordinary motives can erase unusual history. When access is controlled for hunting or conservation, evidence of earlier gathering and management can become harder to study. The absence of a secret plan does not mean that nothing important was lost. Japan's transformation during the second half of the 19th century followed its own political path. The Meiji government sought to centralize authority, modernize administration, develop industry, and redefine land ownership. Forests were valuable for construction, fuel, transport, watershed protection, and state revenue. Land that had been used through village custom could be reclassified under new legal arrangements. Mountain access, shared rights, and local management were placed within a more centralized system. This did not happen everywhere in the same way. Some community practices continued. Some forests were cut heavily, others were protected. Commercial plantations expanded in later periods. What matters for the theory is that a major change in administration could separate people from landscapes they understood in detail. A village might know which slopes produced mushrooms, which groves supplied fodder, and where leaf litter should be gathered for fields. A government map might record the same area as forest land with a number. Once local use declined, knowledge could vanish rapidly. Young people moving to cities no longer learned seasonal routes. The economic value of gathered products fell compared with wages and purchased fuel. Practices that had organised the woodland became unnecessary or illegal. The forest did not need to be physically destroyed for its older system to disappear. It only needed to lose the people who maintained the connections between its parts. Across North America, the creation of parks and reserves often involved an even clearer removal of existing populations. Landscapes described as wilderness had long histories of indigenous burning, hunting, gathering, planting, and travel. Governments treated many of these lands as empty or underused because indigenous land management did not resemble fenced farming. People were removed from areas that later became celebrated as untouched nature. The contradiction is important. A park could protect scenery and wildlife from mining, logging, and private development, while also excluding the communities whose practices had helped shape the ecosystem. Fire suppression then altered forests that had evolved under frequent human burning. Meadows and open woodland shrank. Dense growth increased in some regions. Species that benefited from regular low-intensity fire declined. Officials often believed they were rescuing nature from human interference. They did not necessarily recognise that the landscape before them was partly a result of human activity. The park boundary preserved land while interrupting the processes that had produced the very scenery being protected. Later, visitors saw the changing forest and assumed that any absence of roads or buildings proved an absence of management. This is one of the strongest points supporting the broader theory, although it does not prove a forgotten civilization. Governments did remove people from managed landscapes and call those landscapes wilderness. Traditional food systems were disrupted. Plant communities changed. Official histories often minimized earlier land use. These events are documented within the history of known peoples, and they show how easily living infrastructure can be reclassified. Why would governments prefer the idea of empty wilderness? Partly because it simplified ownership. Recognizing that a forest had been managed by generations of local people created legal and moral complications. If the land was empty, the state could claim it. If it was untouched, officials did not need to compensate those who had maintained it. If local harvesting was described as damage, exclusion could be presented as protection. The image of pristine nature also appealed to urban societies, experiencing rapid industrial change. Cities were crowded, polluted, and noisy. Wilderness became a place imagined as free from human corruption. National parks and reserves offered scenery, recreation, scientific study, and national identity. The people who already lived in those landscapes did not fit easily into the new image. Their presence made the wilderness less empty, so their histories were often reduced or removed from the public story. Elite hunting created a similar pattern for different reasons. Large areas were preserved for game, which sometimes protected forests from agricultural clearance. Local hunting and gathering were restricted, while privileged access continued. The landscape remained productive, but the benefits were redistributed. Deer, boar, and other animals fed on forest resources that might otherwise support community livestock or harvests. A reserve could therefore protect ecological abundance while concentrating its use among a small group. Military concerns added another layer. Border forests, islands, mountain zones, and areas near strategic facilities could be closed or tightly controlled. Restricted access in such places easily produces rumours. Unusual ruins, old roads, or scientific equipment become signs of concealment. In many cases, the hidden subject is military rather than ancient, yet long periods of closure can preserve older landscapes accidentally. A military zone may contain archaeological and ecological evidence simply because development was limited. Scientific research also became more institutional during this period. Forests were classified, measured, and divided into study areas. Researchers collected specimens and developed theories about succession, natural vegetation, and species distribution. Their work expanded knowledge, but it was shaped by the conditions they encountered. If a community had recently been removed, scientists might record the landscape during transition and mistake that moment for its natural baseline. A grove no longer pruned would begin changing. A burned meadow would grow shrubs. A former pasture would fill with trees. The scientists might describe these changes as nature returning, unaware that the previous condition had been stable for centuries under local management. Future policy would then aim to preserve the newly observed state. The older system disappeared twice, first from the land and then from the scientific model. Supporters of the enclosure theory often point to restrictions on scientific access, as evidence that authorities know more than they admit. It is true that some reserves limit sampling, excavation, and publication. The reasons can include conservation, national security, legal disputes, indigenous rights, private ownership, or competition between institutions. Secrecy does not always indicate extraordinary findings. Academic departments have been known to guard ordinary data with enough seriousness to suggest that the location of 3 slightly unusual mushrooms could destabilize civilization. Even so, transparency matters. When governments close areas without clear explanation, suspicion grows. When archives remain difficult to access, rumours fill the gap. When local accounts contradict official histories, people begin looking for deliberate erasure. Authorities may be protecting a fragile ecosystem, but poor communication can make reasonable protection appear sinister. The period from 1850 to 1900 also saw rapid expansion of museums, botanical gardens, seed collections, and scientific expeditions. Plants were moved around the world on a large scale. Colonial powers collected useful species, tested them in new climates, and developed commercial crops. Governments clearly understood that plant genetics and geographical distribution had strategic value. Rubber, tea, cinchona, spices, timber trees, and food crops were tied to empire and industry. This history gives supporters of the theory a plausible motive. If officials discovered forests containing highly productive species combinations, they might have wanted control. Governments and companies did seek monopolies over useful plants. They did restrict movement of seeds and knowledge in some contexts. Biological resources were economically important. However, controlling a valuable species is different from hiding the existence of an ancient global food system. The evidence supports competition over plants, land, and agricultural knowledge. It does not yet support the claim that governments collectively fenced forests to conceal a civilization. The theory becomes stronger when it focuses on appropriation and misclassification, and weaker when it assumes perfect international secrecy. Another motive proposed by supporters is that self-sustaining food forests threatened industrial agriculture. If people could obtain abundant food from common woodland, they would be less dependent on wages, markets, and private landowners. Enclosing the forest would therefore force populations into paid labour and purchased food. There is some historical basis for the broader connection between loss of common land and dependence on wage labour. When households lose access to grazing, fuel and gathering, they must obtain those needs elsewhere. Yet forest foods alone rarely provided everything a large population required. Communities combined woodland resources with fields, livestock, fishing, trade and craft work. A food forest could increase independence, but it was not necessarily a complete replacement for agriculture. The idea that governments destroyed unlimited abundance to create artificial scarcity oversimplifies both the productivity of forests and the complexity of industrial change. Still, access to common resources mattered greatly. A family able to collect fuel, graze an animal, gather nuts, and cut building material needed less cash. Removing those rights made survival more expensive. Enclosure transferred value from shared use into controlled property. The forest may not have been an unlimited source of food, but it was a buffer against hunger and poverty. Losing it changed the balance of power. The enclosure process also changed memory. Once gathering stopped, younger generations no longer knew the harvest locations. Once paths closed, place names lost their practical meaning. Once local varieties were no longer tended, they declined. Officials could then point to the reduced productivity of the forest as proof that it had never supported many people. The policy helped create the evidence used to justify the policy. This is the mechanism by which a food forest could be erased without being cut down. First, access is restricted. Next, maintenance ends. Productive species decline or become less visible. The official category changes from managed land to reserve or wilderness. Records of local use remain scattered in archives. After several generations, the idea that the forest once fed communities begins to sound like folklore. A person entering the protected area today may see fallen fruit, old nut trees, unusual clearings, and traces of water management. They ask why no one uses these resources. The answer is that collection is prohibited because the forest is protected. When they ask why it is protected, they are told that it is untouched. The explanation moves in a circle. The lack of current use becomes evidence that no earlier use existed. This does not mean conservation should be removed. Many ancient forests are under severe pressure from logging, roads, disease, climate change, and tourism. Opening every restricted area to harvesting would destroy evidence and habitat. The lesson is not that gates are always wrong. It is that protection should not require pretending people were never present. A better model would recognise cultural landscapes alongside ecological value. Local communities could be involved in research and management. Traditional practices could be tested rather than dismissed automatically. Some areas might remain strictly protected, while others could support controlled burning, pruning, grazing or gathering, where evidence shows that these practices maintained biodiversity. Conservation would then preserve history as well as trees. For the ancient food forest theory, the 19th century enclosures are important because they created the conditions for forgetting. They centralised land, interrupted customary use, replaced mixed functions with narrow categories, and produced official narratives of wilderness. Whether or not authorities understood what they were erasing, the result was a widespread loss of landscape knowledge. The most likely explanation is not a single event called the Great Enclosure directed from one hidden office. It is a series of overlapping changes driven by industrial demand, state expansion, private property, conservation, colonialism, forestry science, elite hunting, and social transformation. The effects were similar enough to look coordinated because the underlying model of progress was similar. Land should have one owner, one category, and one measurable purpose. Forests should produce timber, protect water, preserve wildlife, or provide scenery. A landscape performing all of those functions while also feeding local people did not fit neatly into the system. Once the new categories were established, the old forest could be renamed without changing its location. A managed grove became natural woodland. A seasonal harvest ground became habitat. A village path became an unauthorized trail. A sacred planting became an unexplained cluster of trees. The label pristine wilderness covered the missing history more effectively than any fence. That transformation leads to the next problem. When managed abundance is reclassified as nature, every remaining sign of cultivation is interpreted as an exception. An old fruit tree becomes an escaped garden plant. A terrace becomes erosion. A clearing becomes storm damage. Local memories become legend. The more successfully the official story is repeated, the harder it becomes to recognise the system that came before it. And this is how productive landscapes can remain visible while their meaning disappears. Once a forest has been separated from the people who used it, the story told about that forest can change surprisingly quickly. The trees may remain in the same place, the streams may continue following the same channels, and the old paths may still be visible beneath leaves. But the official meaning of the landscape becomes something entirely different. A grove that once provided nuts, fruit, honey, grazing, medicine, fuel, and building material can be described as a wilderness where human beings were never more than occasional visitors. The transformation does not require anyone to remove every trace of the past. It requires the traces to be given new explanations. An old fruit tree growing deep inside protected woodland may be described as an escape from a distant garden. A broad clearing may be blamed on wind, fire, or poor soil. A low ridge may be classified as a natural change in the ground. A line of stones may be dismissed as material pushed by roots or frost. A cluster of useful plants may be treated as coincidence. Each explanation may be reasonable on its own, and many will be correct. The difficulty appears when every sign of former management is explained separately, preventing anyone from asking whether the signs belong to one larger system. The phrase pristine wilderness encourages this separation because it begins with a conclusion. If a forest is defined as untouched, then evidence of human use becomes contamination, intrusion, or exception. A charcoal layer indicates a destructive fire rather than controlled burning. A grazed clearing becomes damage rather than habitat management. A harvested grove becomes exploitation rather than agriculture. The same physical evidence changes meaning according to the story placed around it. For much of modern conservation history, the ideal wilderness was imagined as land functioning best in the absence of people. This idea arose partly from real environmental destruction. Industrial logging removed forests at enormous speed. Mining damaged watersheds. Commercial hunting reduced animal populations. Expanding farms, roads, and towns broke apart habitats. Protecting land from these pressures was necessary, and the creation of reserves saved many landscapes that might otherwise have disappeared. The problem was not protection itself. The problem was the assumption that all human influence belonged to the same category. A railway company cutting an entire valley and a local community gathering fallen wood were both forms of human activity, but they did not have the same effect. Industrial clear-cutting and seasonal coppicing were treated as different degrees of disturbance rather than different systems. Large-scale extraction, controlled burning, small livestock herds, fruit tree pruning, and mushroom gathering could all be restricted under the general goal of leaving nature alone. Once that policy was established, forests changed. Some recovered from destructive use. Old trees survived. Wildlife returned. Water quality improved. In those places, protection clearly worked. Elsewhere, the removal of traditional management caused open woodland to close, meadows to shrink, and useful species to decline. Trees that had depended on pruning became overgrown. Plants adapted to regular low-intensity fire disappeared beneath dense vegetation. Ponds filled with sediment. Paths that had carried water and people became blocked. To later visitors, these changes looked like nature reclaiming the land. Thick vegetation became evidence of age. Fallen timber became evidence of non-intervention. The absence of visible settlement became evidence of permanent emptiness. Few people paused to consider that the dense forest might be younger than the open grove it replaced. This reversal is one of the most important parts of the theory. What we now call pristine may not be the oldest condition of the landscape. It may be the most recent condition created after management stopped. The forest can be ancient while its current structure is relatively new. Some trees may have stood for centuries, yet the arrangement of species around them may have changed dramatically within the last 100 years. Old photographs sometimes make this visible. A hillside now covered with dense woodland may once have contained scattered mature trees, grass, and low shrubs. A reserve famous for its closed canopy may have included grazing areas and regularly cut paths. An isolated grove may once have stood beside houses that no longer appear on modern maps. Without the photographs, the current forest looks permanent. With them, it becomes one stage in a continuing history. Pollen records can reveal even longer changes. Sediments accumulating in lakes and wetlands preserve microscopic pollen grains from surrounding plants. By examining layers, researchers can estimate which species were common at different times. A sudden rise in chestnut, walnut, hazel, or other useful plants may suggest climate change, natural spread, or human encouragement. Charcoal in the same layers may indicate repeated burning. When pollen, charcoal, settlement evidence, and old roots appear together, the idea of untouched forest becomes harder to maintain. The meaning of fire is especially easy to reverse. Modern audiences are accustomed to seeing forest fires as disasters, and severe fires certainly can be devastating. Traditional burning often worked differently. Small areas were burned under selected conditions, producing low flames that cleared undergrowth without killing mature trees. This could encourage grasses, berries, edible shoots, grazing animals, and certain tree species. It also reduced the amount of dry fuel available for larger fires. When authorities prohibited all burning, they believed they were protecting the forest. In some regions, the result was thicker undergrowth and a greater risk of severe fire. The later disaster was then attributed to nature rather than to the interruption of an older management system. The people who had maintained the landscape through burning were sometimes blamed for being careless, even though their knowledge may have been precisely what kept the forest stable. Grazing underwent a similar change in meaning. Animals feeding beneath trees can damage seedlings and compact soil when numbers are too high. Carefully controlled grazing, however, can keep clearings open, limit shrubs, spread nutrients, and support a mixture of habitats. Many old European woodlands were shaped by cattle, sheep, goats, deer, and pigs moving through them. Remove those animals and the woodland becomes denser. The new density may look more natural, but it is not necessarily more ancient or more diverse. Fruit and nut production also changes when light disappears. Many productive trees need open space around their crowns. In a managed grove, people remove competing growth and maintain gaps. Once management stops, younger trees rise around the older ones. The canopy closes, flowering decreases, and harvest becomes smaller. A forest that once supplied large amounts of food may still contain the same species, but their yields no longer reveal their former importance. This can produce a misleading modern test. Someone walks through the forest, sees only scattered fruit, and concludes that the landscape could never have fed many people. That conclusion may be based on a system observed after more than a century of neglect. It is similar to visiting an abandoned vineyard covered in scrub and deciding that grapes were never important there because only a few weak vines remain. The idea of abundance is also affected by how food is counted. Modern agriculture is measured in tons per hectare, annual yields, market prices, and standardized products. Forest production is distributed through time and across species. Nuts may be heavy one year and light the next. Berries ripen over weeks. Mushrooms appear according to moisture and temperature. Animals convert leaves, mast, and grass into meat. Honey gathers the value of flowers spread across a wide area. Fuel, medicine, fibre, and building material are harvested beside food. No single product may match the yield of an intensive modern crop, but the combined system can support households in many ways. It spreads risk. A poor fruit year may be balanced by nuts. A failed nut crop may be balanced by livestock, roots, fish, or trade. The forest is not unlimited, but its diversity can make it dependable. When officials evaluated such land mainly for timber, much of that value disappeared from the records. The forest might be called underproductive because it contained trees of different ages and species. Local households could be obtaining food, fuel, and materials from it, yet the state saw low revenue. Scientific forestry offered to improve the land by simplifying it. A mixed system that produced many small benefits was replaced with one that produced a single measurable product. The transformation from managed abundance to pristine wilderness therefore occurred in two directions. Some forests were simplified for industry, while others were closed for protection. both approaches could erase earlier functions. A plantation removed the diversity physically. A strict reserve removed the human knowledge needed to interpret it. One changed the trees, the other changed the story. The word pristine itself deserves attention. It suggests an original condition, free from alteration. Applied to an ancient forest, it creates the impression that human influence must be recent and damaging. Yet people have lived in forested regions for thousands of years. They hunted, gathered, burned, planted, travelled, buried their dead, worshipped, traded and built homes. Their activities differed in intensity, but few productive landscapes existed entirely beyond human contact. The absence of large buildings is not proof of absence. Forest communities often use materials that decay. Houses built from wood, bark, reeds, and earth may leave little visible evidence. Seasonal shelters leave even less. Storage pits fill in. Raised platforms collapse. Fences rot. Trails narrow. Within a few centuries, roots and soil can absorb most of the physical remains. Living evidence may survive longer. A useful tree can reproduce. A selected variety can spread. A fungal community can persist in modified soil. A spring can continue flowing through a channel made generations earlier. The forest preserves its history in forms that conventional archaeology has not always prioritized. This helps explain why some wilderness narratives have been so convincing. Visitors see no monuments, no walls, and no ploughed fields. They assume that no complex management occurred. The landscape appears to confirm the story because the evidence is not shaped like the evidence they expect. There is also a political advantage to the wilderness label. If land is acknowledged as a cultural landscape, questions follow. Who created it? Who maintained it? Who possesses rights to use it? Were communities removed unfairly? Should their descendants be involved in management? If the land is declared empty nature, these questions become easier to avoid. Governments do not need to invent a conspiracy to benefit from forgetting. Bureaucracies often prefer simple categories. Forest, farm, settlement, reserve, and wasteland are easier to administer than a landscape that is all of them at different times. A seasonal gathering right is harder to register than permanent ownership. A sacred grove with shared use is harder to tax than a timber concession. The complexity of the older system becomes an administrative problem, and the solution is to rename it. Colonial administrations used this process repeatedly. Land that lacked fences or permanent fields was described as unused. Mobile communities were treated as people without fixed claims. Burning was labelled destruction. Gathering was treated as taking from nature rather than producing through management. These descriptions justified state control and private settlement. Later conservation sometimes inherited the same assumptions. A colonial government removed people to exploit land, while a conservation authority later restricted people to protect it. The motives were different, but both could deny local authority. The landscape changed hands without the original keepers regaining a voice. This does not mean every local practice was sustainable. Communities can over-harvest, burn too often, hunt animals to scarcity or damage water. Traditional knowledge is not automatically perfect. It develops under particular conditions and can fail when population, climate, technology or markets change. The point is that older practices should be studied according to evidence rather than dismissed because they involve people. The ancient food forest theory often becomes less convincing when it treats all protected areas as proof of deliberate concealment. Many restrictions have obvious conservation reasons. Old forests contain rare species, fragile soils, and slow-growing organisms that can be damaged by uncontrolled access. The removal of plants, soil, or wood may spread disease or destroy research sites. A place can contain traces of former management and still need strict protection today. The stronger argument is that protection has often been built on an incomplete history. Authorities may preserve the visible forest while ignoring the processes that created it. A reserve can be ecologically valuable and culturally misrepresented at the same time. Recognizing past management does not require opening every gate. It requires changing the questions asked inside them. Rather than asking only how to prevent human disturbance, researchers might ask which forms of human activity were part of the ecosystem. Instead of treating every old clearing as damage, they could examine whether it supported particular species. Instead of assuming unusual fruit trees escape from gardens, they could test their genetics and map their relationship to vanished settlements. Instead of dismissing local accounts, they could compare them with pollen, soil, and archival evidence. This approach is already changing the way many landscapes are understood. Historical ecology examines interactions between people and ecosystems over long periods. Archaeobotany studies plant remains connected with human life. Genetic research traces the movement and selection of useful species. Remote sensing reveals roads, terraces, earthworks, and settlement patterns hidden beneath vegetation. None of these methods begins by assuming a forgotten advanced civilization, but all of them weaken the idea that dense forest equals untouched nature. The Amazon has provided some of the clearest challenges to that old assumption. Areas once described as empty rainforest contain earthworks, modified soils, settlement remains, and concentrations of useful tree species. The evidence suggests that substantial populations shaped parts of the forest before European contact. Disease, violence, and displacement later reduced those populations. Vegetation grew over the settlements, and outsiders mistook the resulting forest for a world without history. Similar principles apply elsewhere, even when the scale is smaller. An abandoned European village may become woodland. A Japanese-managed forest may grow dense after fuel gathering ends. A North American oak landscape may close when indigenous burning is suppressed. A royal reserve may preserve trees while hiding the labour of the people who maintained roots, meadows, and animal populations. In each case, the visible wilderness is partly the result of a social interruption. Supporters of the ancient infrastructure theory take this pattern and extend it. They argue that if known societies could shape forests so extensively, an earlier civilization might have done so on an even larger scale. Its systems could survive because they were made from living organisms. Government restrictions might then have sealed the remaining examples before researchers recognized them. The first part of that claim is possible in a general sense. Large-scale forest management can persist through biological inheritance. The second part, involving deliberate concealment, remains unsupported without direct evidence. The timing of enclosure is suggestive, but timing alone is not enough. Governments had many documented reasons to take control of land during the 19th century. Similar policies can emerge from shared economic ideas without a hidden agreement. There is also a practical problem with concealing an entire type of landscape. Forests cross borders. Scientists collect seeds. Local residents remember former uses. Timber companies cut roads. Soldiers, hunters, and officials enter restricted areas. Keeping a discovery secret across many countries and generations would require extraordinary consistency. History usually shows the opposite. Confidential information leaks, archives survive, officials argue, and someone eventually writes a detailed complaint because another department failed to reimburse a train ticket. A less organised form of erasure is far more believable. Each institution sees only part of the evidence. Foresters study trees, archaeologists study ruins, botanists study species, historians study documents, and conservationists study habitat. Local stories remain outside formal research. No one hides the full picture because no one assembles it. The system disappears between disciplines. This fragmented view can make managed abundance look natural. A botanist explains the plant distribution through soil and climate. An archaeologist finds no buildings and concludes that occupation was limited. A historian finds records of gathering but treats them as minor rural activity. A forester sees old trees shaped by cutting but classifies them as former timber management. Each interpretation may be reasonable. The food-forest possibility appears only when the separate observations are placed together. Even then, the word engineered must be used carefully. It does not have to mean a master plan drawn by one authority. A landscape can become highly organised through repeated local decisions. One generation protects a grove, another expands it. A neighbouring community introduces a new variety. Traders bring seeds. Herders spread plants along routes. Religious rules protect water sources. Over centuries, the combined result functions like infrastructure, even though no one designed the entire system at once. Cities also grow this way. Streets follow old paths. Buildings replace earlier buildings. Water systems are repaired and extended. Different rulers add walls, markets, temples, stations, and roads. The final city appears planned in some areas and irregular in others. A forest shaped through generations of use could develop similarly, with layers of design, accident, repair, and natural growth. Calling such a landscape pristine removes those layers. It freezes the forest in the present and treats the current arrangement as timeless. The chestnut is only a tree. The pond is only a wetland. The path is only an animal trail. The clearing is only a gap. The people who once understood how the parts work together become irrelevant. The loss is not only historical, it may limit modern solutions. Cities today face food, insecurity, heat, flooding, soil damage, and the loss of biodiversity. Tree-based food systems could address several of these problems at once. Fruit and nut trees provide shade, absorb water, store carbon, support wildlife, and produce food. Shrubs, vines, herbs, and fungi can add further yields. Such systems cannot replace all agriculture, but they can make urban and rural landscapes more resilient. If older societies developed productive forest systems, studying them could reveal practical methods adapted to local climates. Which species survived drought? Which combinations protected soil? How are harvests shared? How are animals integrated? Which rules prevented overuse? The answers may be more valuable than proving the existence of a lost civilization. There is an uncomfortable possibility behind the theory. Perhaps the forests were not hidden because they contained impossible technology. Perhaps they became invisible because modern institutions did not recognize abundance unless it could be owned, measured, and sold. A landscape feeding communities through shared access appeared less productive than a plantation producing timber for a market. A forest providing many small benefits seemed disorganized beside a field producing one large crop. Once value was defined narrowly, the old system became easy to erase. The land was enclosed, the keepers left, and the yields declined. Later officials observed the reduced production and concluded that the forest had never been agricultural. The disappearance of the harvest confirmed the new classification. The remaining signs can still create confusion. A visitor finds old fruit trees in a reserve and asks who planted them. The official explanation points to a farm that no longer exists. Another grove appears farther away, then another. A map reveals vanished paths. Soil tests show charcoal. Local stories describe seasonal gathering. None of these clues is decisive alone, but together they suggest that the boundary between forest and farm was once less clear. This may be what was truly erased, not an unlimited supply of food, but a way of seeing land. The older system did not separate production from ecology as sharply as modern agriculture often does. A tree could be habitat and crop. A wetland could store water and provide food. An animal could be wild, hunted, managed, and part of the forest's reproductive cycle. Human use did not always require complete conversion. The wilderness story replaced that flexible relationship with a simple opposition. Nature belonged inside the fence. Human production belonged outside it. One side was protected from people, while the other was intensified for them. The result preserved important forests, but also concentrated food production into more vulnerable systems. Now, the surviving ancient groves sit between these categories. They are protected as nature, studied as ecosystems, and remembered in fragments as former sources of food. Their roots continue exchanging nutrients. Their old water patterns still influence growth. Some trees fruit in cycles that once organised labour and storage. The system may still function, although no one agrees on what its function originally was. The final question is therefore not only whether these landscapes were engineered, it is whether they remain usable as biological infrastructure. Could their old productivity be restored without damaging them? Would careful pruning, burning, grazing and planting reveal a hidden design? Or would intervention destroy ecosystems that have developed during the years of protection? Are the restrictions preserving the last evidence of ancient management, or preventing that evidence from being examined? Answering those questions requires more than finding an unusual grove or an old map. It requires testing the entire theory against what the forests are doing now. Their fruiting cycles, genetics, soils, water, fungi, wildlife and historical records would need to tell the same story. Only then could we decide whether the gates protect ordinary wilderness, the remains of known cultural landscapes, or something larger that has continued operating quietly beneath a name it was never meant to have. If the ancient groves were once designed to produce food, the final question is whether they are still doing it. The easiest answer is yes, because trees still fruit, fungi still connect with roots, rain still enters the soil, and animals still spread seeds. The harder answer depends on what we mean by working. A machine is working when it performs the task it was built to perform. A forest does not make that distinction so neatly. It can continue growing while losing the purpose people once gave it. It can remain healthy as an ecosystem while becoming less useful as a food system. It can also continue producing food in large quantities even after no one remembers where to gather it, how to process it, or which parts of the landscape must be maintained for the harvest to continue. A chestnut tree does not stop producing because the village that planted it has disappeared. An old pear does not need a property document before it flowers. Hazels can spread into nearby clearings. Oaks continue their mass cycles. Berry shrubs move along forest edges, birds carry seeds, and fungi remain connected to roots that may descend from trees planted many generations earlier. In that basic sense, a living system can outlast its managers more successfully than almost any structure made from stone, wood, or metal. A bridge collapses when repairs stop. A grove may reproduce. Survival, however, is not the same as full function. A food forest depends on light spacing, water, soil, pollinators, animal numbers, and the balance between species. If pruning ends, branches become crowded. If clearings close, fruiting trees receive less sunlight. If grazing stops, shrubs may overwhelm low-growing food plants. If seed collection ends, animals may consume most of a crop before useful varieties can spread. If an old tree dies and no one protects its seedlings, the next generation may never replace it. The result is gradual decline rather than sudden failure. A forest that once supported regular harvests might still appear productive, but the yield becomes more irregular. Some species disappear. Others spread too widely. Trees selected for large fruit may cross with wild relatives. Paths to productive areas vanish. Water structures fill with debris. The biological system continues, but the human system attached to it is gone. This makes the theory difficult to test by looking only at present-day abundance. A forest producing little food now may have produced much more under active management. A forest producing heavily now may be naturally productive rather than engineered. The current harvest is evidence, but it is not a complete record of the past. Researchers would need to ask a more specific set of questions. Are useful species present in greater numbers than expected? Do they occur in combinations that match human dietary needs? Are old food-producing trees concentrated near former settlements, roots, water sources, or earthworks? Do their genetics show selection for size, taste, storage, or predictable ripening? Does the soil contain evidence of long-term burning, composting, animal keeping, or occupation? Do tree ages reveal planting phases rather than ordinary regeneration? Do old records describe harvests that match the biological evidence still visible today? If several of these lines of evidence point in the same direction, the argument becomes stronger. One unusual tree can be explained easily. A whole landscape of unusual trees, modified soil, old paths, water features, harvest records, and selected genetics is harder to dismiss. The discovery would not automatically prove a forgotten advanced civilization, but it could reveal an underestimated system of long-term forest management. The phrase "still working" also raises a practical question. Could people return to these landscapes and gather food again? In some places, perhaps they could. In others, the attempt would cause serious damage. Ancient forests may contain rare species, fragile soils, nesting areas, shallow roots, and ecological relationships that cannot support large numbers of harvesters. A productive grove is not necessarily an invitation to arrive with several buses, promotional banners, and an enthusiastic plan for unlimited chestnut flour. Protected status may be one reason the systems still survive at all. Restrictions can preserve old trees, prevent logging, and limit soil disturbance. If ancient food forest features remain, the fence may be protecting them even when officials do not interpret them that way. Opening every area to unrestricted gathering would risk destroying the evidence before it is understood. The opposite problem is also possible. Strict non-intervention may allow a former food system to decline. Fruit trees can disappear beneath shade, open habitats can close, fire-dependent species can be lost, old water structures can fail. A policy designed to preserve nature may unintentionally erase the last functional traces of older management. That conflict cannot be resolved through one rule applied everywhere. Some areas need to remain untouched. Others may benefit from careful restoration. The decision should follow evidence rather than ideology. Researchers could begin with small trials outside the most sensitive zones. Selected trees could be pruned. Old clearings could be reopened gradually. Traditional burning could be tested under controlled conditions where it's ecologically appropriate. Local varieties could be propagated in nearby research orchards. Soil, insects, fungi, water and wildlife could be monitored before and after intervention. If productivity increases without harming biodiversity, that would suggest the landscape once depended on management. If intervention causes damage or produces little benefit, the current ecosystem may have moved too far from its former condition, or the food forest interpretation may be wrong. Either result would teach us something. The role of local communities would be essential. People whose families live near these forests may retain knowledge that does not appear in scientific papers. They may remember harvest locations, old paths, tree names, seasonal rules, or methods of processing foods that modern visitors consider inedible. A bitter nut may become useful after soaking. A hard fruit may store through winter. A plant ignored by commercial agriculture may have been valued for medicine, fibre, fodder, or preservation. This knowledge should not be treated as decorative folklore added after the formal research is complete. It can help shape the research questions. A remembered grove can be sampled. A local name can guide map analysis. A story about an old spring can be compared with elevation and soil data. The strongest investigation would combine oral history, ecology, archaeology, genetics, and archives, rather than allowing each field to study a separate fragment. There is also the question of scale. A small managed grove can be identified more easily than a landscape covering hundreds of square kilometres. The larger the claimed system, the more evidence should exist. A continent-scale food forest would require the movement of plants, long-term coordination, storage, processing, roots, and social organisation. It would leave genetic and archaeological traces across many locations. If those traces are absent, the grand version of the theory becomes difficult to defend. It is not enough to find similar trees in distant forests. Many useful species have wide natural ranges, and people have moved plants for thousands of years without belonging to one unified civilization. Trade, migration, marriage, pilgrimage, conquest, and ordinary seed exchange can create broad patterns. A more realistic possibility is that many societies independently developed forest-based food systems because the basic advantages are obvious. Trees live for a long time, nuts store well, fruit provides sugar and vitamins, animals benefit from mast, forests protect water and soil. People living in different regions could discover similar methods without contact. Later observers might mistake these parallel traditions for the work of one lost culture. This explanation does not make the achievement less impressive. A landscape shaped by hundreds of local communities over thousands of years can be more complex than one designed from a central plan. It adapts to soil, climate, language, custom, and changing needs. Knowledge is tested repeatedly. Failed varieties disappear. Successful combinations spread. The final system is the result of many decisions, most of which were never written down. The forest can therefore remain functional even when no one person understands the whole arrangement. One family knows the nuts, another tends bees, herders manage grazing, healers gather plants, hunters watch animal cycles, children learn berry locations, elders remember drought years. The system exists in the shared knowledge of the community. When that community is removed, the forest loses its human nervous system. The trees and fungi remain connected, but the decisions that balanced harvest, disturbance, and renewal stop. What survives is the biological half of the infrastructure. This may explain why old forests can appear both abundant and neglected. Fruit falls without being gathered. Nut crops feed expanding animal populations. Old varieties remain in isolated pockets. Paths disappear, but trees still mark them. Water continues collecting in basins whose edges have softened. The system is active, yet no longer directed toward people. Some supporters of the theory see this continuing productivity as proof that the forests were designed to operate indefinitely. They argue that a truly advanced system would need little human input. That idea should be treated cautiously. Every productive landscape has limits, and even resilient systems require correction. Storms, disease, climate shifts, invasive species, and changing animal populations can alter the balance. A forest may recover from disturbance, but recovery does not guarantee that it will continue producing the same foods in the same quantities. Ancient managers may have planned for variation rather than permanence. They could plant several varieties of the same tree, use species adapted to different conditions, spread groves across elevations, and maintain alternative food sources. The system would survive not because nothing changed, but because it contained enough diversity to absorb change. That principle is useful today. Modern food production often depends on large areas of genetically similar crops. Uniformity makes planting and harvesting efficient, but it can also make disease and weather damage more severe. A diverse perennial system grows more slowly and is harder to mechanize, yet it can spread risk across species, seasons, and layers. The old food forests, if that is what some of these landscapes are, may still work best as examples rather than as storehouses waiting to be reopened. Their greatest value could be the design principles preserved within them. Researchers might learn how deep-rooted and shallow-rooted plants share water, how old varieties resist local diseases, how mixed canopies handle heat, and how controlled disturbance maintains productivity. Those lessons could be applied in new food forests near towns and cities where access would not threaten ancient ecosystems. Parks could include nut and fruit trees. Flood control landscapes could combine water storage with edible planting. School grounds, housing developments, abandoned industrial sites, and transport corridors could support layered vegetation. The result would not provide unlimited food, but it could produce useful amounts while cooling streets, supporting wildlife, and reducing runoff. Urban food forests already face practical difficulties. Fruit needs to be harvested, Fallen produce can create slippery paths and attract pests. Nut trees may take years to mature. Soil near roads may be contaminated. Public planting requires maintenance, and not everyone agrees on who should receive the harvest. A system designed to serve a community needs rules, responsibility, and long-term funding. Planting trees for a photograph is easy. Caring for them for 50 years is where the real work begins. Ancient systems probably solved these issues through ownership customs, seasonal rights, and shared labour. One group may have pruned while another harvested. Certain trees may have belonged to households while others were communal. Rules could limit how much each person took. Festivals may have organised collection and processing. Taboos may have protected seed trees and water sources. Without social structure, biological abundance can be depleted. A productive forest is not self-managing in the political sense. People still need to decide who enters, what can be taken, and what must be left behind. This may be one reason old systems were easier to destroy than to restore. The trees could be replanted, but the shared rules were harder to rebuild. The theory often asks whether governments restricted access to protect the forests from humanity or to prevent humanity from discovering them. The evidence suggests that the real answer may include parts of both, along with several less dramatic motives. Governments protected timber, hunting rights, borders, water, wildlife, and national symbols. They also controlled land, displaced communities, and simplified histories. Some restrictions preserved ecosystems, others transferred resources to elites or institutions. Many did several things at once. There is no need to choose one universal motive. A reserve in Poland and Belarus has a different history from an island forest in Japan or a national park in North America. This similar result, limited local access and an official wilderness story, does not prove the same cause. It shows that modern states often prefer controlled landscapes with clear categories. If evidence of ancient management threatens anything, it may threaten the category rather than the government. A forest acknowledged as a human-shaped food system forces conservationists, historians, and landowners to reconsider old assumptions. It complicates the idea that nature flourishes only when people disappear. It raises questions about whose knowledge created biodiversity and whose rights should be recognised. That is uncomfortable, but it is not the same as revealing a hidden machine capable of feeding the world. The forests are unlikely to contain a simple solution to hunger. Their yields are seasonal, their ecosystems are limited. Many foods require processing. Large-scale gathering could damage wildlife and regeneration. Climate change may already be shifting the cycles on which older systems depended. The word unlimited is therefore best understood as a challenge to short-term thinking. A well-managed perennial system can renew its harvest for centuries. It does not need to be replanted every year. It can produce while building soil rather than exposing it. Compared with a field that must be prepared each season, the grove can seem almost endless. Compared with the needs of an unlimited population, it is not. What the forests may offer is a different kind of wealth. Their value is spread across time. The person who plants may not receive the greatest harvest. The benefits belong partly to future generations. That makes them difficult to fit into systems that demand quick returns, but it also makes them powerful examples of long-term planning. A tree planted today can produce after the planter has died. Its roots can hold soil through storms. Its shade can cool people not yet born. Its descendants can spread beyond the original site. The investment remains alive and capable of adaptation. Few forms of infrastructure behave that way. Perhaps this is why the older systems became so easy to misunderstand. Their builders did not leave a completed object. They began a process. Later generations inherited the responsibility to continue it. When that responsibility was broken, the process did not stop immediately. It continued in a reduced and altered form. leaving enough evidence to create the questions we're asking now. Somewhere inside an old reserve, a tree may still produce fruit selected by people whose names are unknown. Its roots may follow a terrace that no longer looks artificial. Fungi may connect it to younger trees growing beyond the original grove. Animals may carry its seeds along a route once walked by harvesters. None of this proves a forgotten civilization, but it shows how human choices can remain active inside an ecosystem long after the story attached to them has disappeared. The most responsible conclusion is not that every restricted forest is a concealed farm. It is that the distinction between wilderness and cultivation has often been drawn too sharply. Many forests are natural systems with long human histories. Some contain abandoned orchards and managed groves. Others preserve large cultural landscapes shaped through fire, grazing, planting, and gathering. A smaller number may contain arrangements more extensive than current records explain. Finding out will require access, but not careless access. It will require sampling, but not uncontrolled excavation. It will require listening to local communities, opening archives, testing genetics, mapping soils, and comparing protected forests with nearby landscapes. The theory should be allowed to face evidence strong enough to disprove it. Otherwise, every restriction becomes proof, every missing record becomes concealment, and every unusual tree becomes part of a plan. A claim that explains everything cannot be tested, and therefore tells us very little. If the patterns disappear under careful study, then the forests remain extraordinary for reasons that do not require ancient engineering. If the patterns hold, we may have to rewrite parts of agricultural and environmental history. Either result is worth the effort. And now, after following old paths, disputed maps, fruiting cycles, route networks, government boundaries, and the people who vanished from the official record, we return to the question that began this investigation. Were these forests fenced to keep humanity from damaging them, or to keep humanity from understanding them? The answer may not be as clean as either choice. Some gates protect rare life. Some preserve old power. Some stand where rulers once reserved game. Some mark military borders. Some replaced village customs with state law. Most were built for reasons already visible in history. Yet behind those gates, the forests may still contain evidence that earlier societies understood land in a way modern institutions forgot. They may have known how to produce food without clearing every tree. They may have built fertility through charcoal, animals, fungi, and leaf litter. They may have stored water in soil rather than reservoirs alone. They may have treated groves as shared inheritance rather than short-term property. Their methods were not unlimited, effortless, or perfect, but they may have been durable enough to survive the loss of the people who practiced them. So before you drift away tonight, think about the oldest grove near you. Consider who planted it, who gathered there, who named its paths, and which parts of its history are missing from the sign at the entrance. Perhaps it is exactly what it appears to be. Perhaps the unusual trees came from a forgotten orchard. Perhaps the ridges beneath the leaves are only geology. Or perhaps the landscape is still performing an old task that no one has remembered to ask about. Wherever you are listening from, I would be interested to know whether your region has a protected forest, an abandoned orchard, or a place where useful trees grow with no obvious explanation. If you found this investigation calming or thought-provoking, you can give the video a like, subscribe to Just About Earth, and share it with someone who looks at a locked woodland gate and wonders what existed there before the lock. For now, the trees will continue without our conclusion. They will respond to rain, trade nutrients through roots and fungi, produce heavy crops in some years and almost nothing in others, and slowly cover the remains of every path we fail to use. Whether they are wilderness, agriculture, or something between the two, they are still working. The only question is whether we have remembered how to read what they're doing,